Hello, my name is Jeremy Elledge, and I'm going to be one of your co-presenters for today's training. And I want to introduce Robert Lee, my co-presenter for today, and I'll let him introduce himself. And I want to thank the Evolution Foundation for sponsoring us, and he can tell you more about them. Robert?
Thanks, Jeremy. As Jeremy said, my name's Robert Lee. I'm a retired social worker and I'm retired from social work, but I work with the Evolution Foundation, which is a small private nonprofit organization that works with community coalitions around the state. One of the main things that we have done over the last year or so is working with schools and other community partners to work on introducing concepts related to trauma, and along with that, Handle with Care, which is a collaboration between law enforcement, schools, and behavioral health providers. My background with police is fairly extensive. I started in 1980 working at a mental health center in Norman, Oklahoma. We had an inpatient unit at the time, and I worked with police closely almost every night. I worked the 3 to 11 shift, and every night when they would encounter a mentally ill person, the police and I would work together to find a solution for dealing with that person. Frequently that involved emergency orders of detention, which required hospitalization. We were, as I said, an inpatient unit, so we had that capacity. That element has shifted around over the years. The number of beds that have been available has decreased, so the load has frequently gone to police officers. And so we came up with the idea that we wanted to be able to work with our community coalitions to provide training for not only our other community partners, but also for police who encounter trauma every day. And whether it's their own trauma or an individual that is experiencing trauma at the moment that they encounter them or has a history of trauma, we wanted to be able to provide some skills and some knowledge, and so people would be aware of what kind of things happen to a person's brain and body when they have a traumatic event. So that's what we're going to be doing today. As I said, the Evolution Foundation is sponsoring this training and has done a lot over the last few months, especially in the northeast part of the state, to implement Handle with Care programs and to also provide schools with alternatives to for children who are having a traumatic event, having a bad day. We provided calming rooms, what we call calming rooms or reset rooms, for teachers to be able to send that child, rather than to respond to them punitively, as has been done in the past, to be able to send them to a place where they can be quiet, where the behavioral health specialist can meet with them and help them work through the event. So with that background, Jeremy and I have worked together for many years. The first job that we had together was at the Oklahoma Youth Center, which is now the Children's Recovery Center, which is the children's inpatient hospital for the state of Oklahoma. So we had a lot of experience working with traumatized children. In fact, the Oklahoma Youth Center was the first freestanding, state-owned and operated psychiatric hospital in the nation to receive a grant from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which enabled us to be able to do some training, which Jeremy was actually a recipient of that training, and has been able to carry that on from that was 2004. Was that?
Two?
It was in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
It was after 9/11.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah, it's been a while, but so that's where we first started working together, and I've worked in both inpatient and outpatient settings, in adult and children's settings, so and now Jeremy's continuing to do that work. So Jeremy, I'll turn it over to you, and you can, I'll come back in a few minutes and talk to everyone about Handle with Care to give a little bit more information about how police can work with their community partners. And we have some stellar police work going on in Tahlequah, my part of the state that I work in, Tahlequah, Grove, Miami, where that program has already been initiated. So we're doing some good work there, but I'll talk more about how that happened and how we can make it happen elsewhere. So Jeremy, I'll turn it over to you, buddy.
All right. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. So got to be a part of one of Oklahoma's first trauma grants, and we did help measurably improve outcomes in the settings where we were implementing this model of organizational culture and change. But that was a time-limited grant, and so after a few years it was over, and the needs of our state remained great, and so wanted to continue to teach trauma-informed interventions in Oklahoma. So I started this organization because Oklahoma is, by many measures, #1 in the nation for traumatizing children. And so some measures have us as low as #3, but again, we're certainly in the top 5 by many measures of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And many of you guys are born and raised in Oklahoma like myself, and for us Okies, that I think we can all agree that hurts our Okie pride. There's a lot of those first in the worst kind of people facts about Oklahoma. I reject the notion that there's anything wrong with us as a people, but I will say that we are an injured people. So injured that we often don't even always notice when we are injured. And so anyway, I started Newview Healing Solutions. We're in our 4th year of operation now, and we're really proud to do mental health training. We get continuing education out for our mental health professionals, and we try to get that really to be affordable and accessible and real, because we all have probably been to training that was just kind of going through the motions, checking the box so we can say that we covered it to cover liability or legal mandates or whatever. But sometimes I think training forgets to make it real. And that's one of the things I think that we want to we pride ourselves on, is trying to just give you as much as we've got, and to make it real, affordable and accessible for all of our mental health folks that need their annual continuing education. And we thank all of the folks that support us to do that, and those that do support us to do that help us help our police officer friends and our school teacher friends. Because one thing that we're committed to as an organization, Newview Healing Solutions, we will provide free training to every single police department in the state of Oklahoma and every single school. And I just want to reiterate, we do that for free. I got a kid growing up here, and you guys, a lot of you have kids growing up here, so it's just about bettering our state. It's just about us joining together to do something, because I think a lot of us will acknowledge that we have problems that must be addressed, but I think many of us in society have perhaps glazed to that, have become overwhelmed or desensitized to all of the problems that we see in the world. And so we here at Newview and at the Evolution Foundation, when people say, "What are you going to do?" we say something. And so just like our officer and school teacher friends, you guys wake up every day and you see how overwhelming the world can be, and you keep getting up every day and you say you give your something. So thank you for that. And so thank you for everybody that's kind of supporting us to do what we do. And so we're going to talk to you today, and we're going to try to keep it real. My name is Jeremy Elledge, and like I said, I'll be the main presenter today, and Robert's going to be my co-presenter. And I will say that I am vision impaired, so I'm not going to be reading any notes to you or reading my a script or anything like that. It's going to be spontaneous, and so I'll try my best not to talk too fast or stutter too much or anything like that, because what I may lack in memory or intelligence, I'll certainly probably make up for with enthusiasm, because this is a topic that means a lot to me. It means a lot to us. And so thanks again. You can check us out if you're here on our website. That's where we're offering this. And so if you have questions, we're still ironing out the process for how we will get you your CEUs. We want to make sure that you do sign in, and we'll have a process for that. And you can email us info@newviewhealingsolutions.org. And so thanks again. And so we'll go to that first informational slide. So I think it's really important for us to understand how we came to understand trauma, what trauma is and what it does to people. And we haven't always known it. I think we're still uncovering and discovering new things about how trauma affects our brain, our heart, our nervous system, our development, and how it affects us in different stages of life. And so now it was first certainly a condition or a symptom or an illness that was recognized among war veterans first. In the United States of America, typically it would be males that went to war, and they would come back and they would be very affected by their experiences in war. And so those who had never been to war didn't have much. They could only imagine what it would be like, but they couldn't really imagine what it would be like, so their understanding was quite limited. And many war veterans were jumpy. They had the exaggerated startle response, and so that was one way that people came to understand trauma, or what it is or what it does to people, is that it makes you jumpy, and it's about loud noises. And so certainly when you have guns and cannons and all kinds of things happening in the battlefield, loud noises would be part of it, but it was certainly a much more all-immersive experience that it dealt with physical pain and emotional pain as well. And so it wasn't until other populations were detected to have trauma that we actually had a more full understanding of what this issue is and how it affects us. And trauma is an injury, and I'll repeat that probably a lot throughout what we're doing. And so, but it was it's interesting. I've often asked kind of a trivia question among our mental health, audiences that we've talked about, and I'll, pose this to you guys. If you are familiar on how we've prosecuted the first case of child abuse in the United States of America, because we did not initially have laws that protected children. There were, children were basically property. And so if you guessed animal protection law, then you would have been correct. There were cases of, child abuse happening all over, and it was par for the course. It was what you did. It was just normal. And so when I don't exactly recall, someone happened upon a case of abuse where a child, I believe, was locked up or chained up and had been abused so heinously that they did contact authorities and protest that there was a crime happening. And so police came and they saw what was happening to this child, and they said, well, there's no law on the books that says that they can't, but we agree this isn't right. So they intervened under animal protection law, because apparently we protected livestock and animals that we intended to eat or work to death or ride or have as pets. We protected those before we protected our smallest, most vulnerable developing human beings. And so, little ones have often been kind of referred to as seen and not heard, speak when spoken to, some of those old-time cliches that you often hear about kids. And so, women, often it was very common and even acceptable to abuse your wife or partner. And so, if anyone is familiar with the old rule of thumb law, and so, it's a phrase that is used, I think, pretty harmlessly. And, rule of thumb, usually it seems like some kind of measure, rule of thumb, it's about this wide or whatever. But what that actually meant, it was not a law, but a legal precedent, in fact, where a judge actually did rule that a man could still beat his wife, but as long as it was with nothing a rod no wider than his thumb, because women were being harmed too badly at the hands of their partners. And so, and of course, partnership marriage in those days did very much resemble ownership, of course. And so, I guess ladies had to hope that their guys had skinny fingers or whatever, because it was okay to beat them, as long as you didn't beat them to death, or as long as you didn't cause major brain injuries, because apparently, that wasn't right, and it was probably pretty inconvenient for society as well. So before that time, if women and children sought help from law enforcement or someone in the community about abuse or being harmed in their home, they were very often sent back to their abusers. because these were at-home matters, these were family affairs, not to be dealt with in the community. And so, so a lot of negative norms, a lot of things that we just see and breathe and take in as normal growing up, pass from generation to generation in a time that's really pre-logic. When our brains are young, they're just vacuuming up data. Literally just looking around, listening, feeling, experiencing, and vacuuming up data. And hopefully little ones only get to vacuum up good, healthy, wholesome data. That seems to be increasingly scarce in this world. But when it comes time for them to have their feelings and relationships and experiences of their own, when they reach into their cognitive cookie jar, those are the cookies they have to pull out. And so I think it's really important for us to understand how we came to understand trauma. And of course, now we're also seeing that a number of our marginalized populations have had measurable trauma for generations that we're just now starting to understand and experience. And so I think it's important for us to recognize, none of us were around for the foundations of our nation. None of us were here for the founding fathers, or when, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or when slaves were kidnapped from their nation. None of us were there for that. Or when indigenous people were massacred, and for the remaining few to be moved into the smallest portions of the country where the resources were not very abundant. And so none of us were around for that, but we did, I think so much learning is foundational. We learn from someone who learned from someone who learned from someone who learned from someone. And once upon a time, racism was certainly used to justify harm against another person. And so we have to recognize the lingering impacts that still has to this day, because I think, we see more unrest, more division in our country than we've seen in a long time, certainly ever that I can recall in our lifetime. So we've got our work cut out for us, but I think, again, it's important for us to understand what trauma really is before we are able to do something about it. So humans have always been a violent species. I think some of it is, perhaps innate, instinctive, natural, and, even necessary. Our earliest ancestors had to hunt and fight off predators a lot. The natural world for them was a pretty scary place. It was kill or be killed. And so some of that, is understandably natural and necessary. In this day and age, we see that there are still some, I guess, necessities for violence, but certainly in what we call a sane and civilized society, there would be less natural need for aggression or violence. But I think, we have to look at what it does to us, though, because over time, we can certainly adapt to the use of violence, and as we become an increasingly injured nation, one of the symptoms that we'll talk about here in a little while of traumas is hypervigilance, hypersensitivity. And so when people are hypersensitive, we see that anxiety turns to agitation, turns to anger and aggression quite easily. And so that becomes kind of a dangerous combination, a deadly cocktail, when we see so many injured people interacting with one another because of that hypervigilance and injured people being injured with one another. So as we become an increasingly stressed society, we just see some of this ramping up. And so again, we need to defend ourselves sometimes. We need to fight off the occasional predator if there's a dog that is trying to attack us or something like that, a burglar trying to harm us. But we see violence breaking out because they're asked to follow a rule on an airplane, or we see people fighting in traffic. I mean, that's always been a thing, but even cases of road rage are going up. And so because we're not a bad people, but we are an injured people, and we're being injured with one another. And so anyway, we'll move on. in being either number 1, number 2, number 3 in ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, I'm going to introduce you to a study in a little while that kind of breaks that down a little bit, helps us understand the implications. But I think it's also important for us to understand how we came to be such an injured people, because it started early for us. And so, and I want to, in therapy they say, be strength-based and emphasize the positive and everything. And I feel the need to really emphasize our resilience here, because we are an injured people, but we're a resilient people. But for us, it started, a lot of Oklahomans and their ancestors started and were moved here in the Trail of Tears. And again, the fractional percentage of Native Americans who were allowed to survive were collected and forced into the Trail of Tears, which we got to learn some about in school. I think we even did a walk, and we had trail mix in our bag, and we commemorated the Trail of Tears or whatever. So that was part of how Oklahoma started. And of course the land run, where people got to go and stake claims on some of the ground that was given to the Native Americans from the Trail of Tears and those treaties. And so we had the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. These hit Oklahoma particularly hard. We also know that we are home to the deadliest and worst race massacre in United States history in 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre, when a black man was accused of a crime, and then the state sanctioned basically the slaughter and destruction of a community, a wealthy community. And so we talk about generational trauma. If for those that had wealthy grandparents that left them, some of their means, you think about the hundreds of families who didn't get to leave anything to their families, and businesses, homes, or or anything else. And so those heinous crimes weren't even investigated by law enforcement or anyone else until 1997. They didn't even investigate murders for 56 years. And so we can only imagine why they waited so long to investigate those crimes. And of course they published their findings in 2001. I graduated in 1997. Right down the road from where a lot of those atrocities took place. I had no idea. And so, and I think that's why I think it's so important for us to know our history and not call it a theory. If something happened, we can talk about it and not worry about how people are going to, experience it emotionally or whatever. So anyway, we also know that we are home to the worst domestic terrorism in 1995 when scumbag McVeigh blew up a bunch of innocent people because he was angry at the government. And so we are traumatized people because of that. And we have some of the wickedest weather that we're just kind of accustomed to. Yeah, it's about that time again this year to wonder where and if it's going to happen. Other places in the world, I guess they've all kind of got their stuff, but we're known all over the world. I think it's kind of funny. I saw a couple interviewed from Australia. They wanted to go and see where Twisted was filmed. And so that's funny to us, because it's just our pastures. That's Hollywood stuff for some people. But so we've bounced back, though, is the point. One of the things that I think about, we're an injured people. But we're a resilient people, because when they started having tornadoes in other places that they're not used to having them, who'd they call? What do? They called Oklahoma, because we know what to do about tornadoes. When they had floods in Hurricane Katrina, when they had the 2011 terrorist attacks. They called Oklahoma because we have dealt with pain. We've counseled people. We've rebuilt lives and buildings over and over again. And so we know this stuff of the injuries of trauma. And so, but I think it's time for us as a people to take the next step, because we're survivors. And I think that we want to see that more of our Oklahomans, our kids, our families are not just survivors, but thrivers. And so anyway, that's kind of my history lesson on Oklahoma and how we came to be as injured and resilient as we are. So, like I mentioned before, I'm not going to read to you my slides. You guys can read those there on your screen. And if anyone would like a copy of today's presentation, simply email us info@newviewhealingsolutions.org. We want to share information with anyone who you might feel is beneficial. And again, for those of you who long for some good old-fashioned in-person live training, we will come out and provide a day's worth of training to your police department. No charge at all. So hit us up if you want us to do that. But trauma and chronic stress, these are not exactly the same definitions or words or concepts, but they have similar impact on us. And so a trauma, of course, can usually be noticed. We understand a trauma as a significant negative or adverse event that happens to us and it changes us. And so, when we talk about trauma, we used to understand that trauma was loud noises. And so we'd speak softly around those who had been so afflicted. And so, but we know more about what trauma is and what trauma does now. And so I like to, think about the brain stuff, think about the physiology and why we have the symptoms and why it hits us the way that we do. But emotions are these electrical and neurochemical processes. And so every time we feel a feeling, our brain is giving us a little bit of juice to let us know that we're having that feeling and that experience. And so we need all feelings. All of them are necessary in some way, shape, or form. But if we experience too much of the pain indicators, then it does harm us. And so trauma is something that is usually a noticeable event. If you walked across the street and you got hit by a car, and then you were afraid or emotional in some way about that experience, you didn't want to walk across the street anymore, then you understand where that came from. If the dog bites you, then you're uncomfortable around dogs or that dog, then you understand that impact. But chronic stress is a little different. It can be a little bit more insidious because trauma is noticeable. Chronic stress can happen in small bites and small amounts. And for those of us who do work in high stress jobs, who do have a lot to focus on or who do have to move quickly from one stressor to the next without the ability to process that, then we do see impacts from chronic stress. And so again, we're having the same smaller doses of neurochemical and electrical impulse without the big cognitive nodes in our brain. And so again, chronic stress can, I think, creep up on us a little bit. It's still an injury. So let's go to the next slide, and I think that's where we talk about the injuries.
Natural symptoms of trauma.
Okay, so the natural symptoms of trauma, and I think I mentioned these as much. Now, these are something that officers are going to be recognizing, perhaps in people that they're interacting with in the community. But show me a human being, and certainly an officer, that doesn't have some trauma or chronic stress, and I want to give you a high five because you are doing it well. But most human beings have some trauma, and people in high stress or high danger jobs certainly are going to have their symptoms and their injuries. So I'll go through these, and one of the things that I tell injured people, I work with a lot of injured people, and we do these educational groups. What I didn't used to realize is that anyone can struggle. When I thought about a mental illness such as post-traumatic stress, or I thought about more severe mental illness, things you would see in an inpatient facility like Griffin Memorial. people that had to use straitjackets or had to be restrained or had to be sedated, or they didn't really know what was going on. Very unfortunate, levels of mental illness. But that's, that what a lot of us thought of. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. I didn't think about normal people, that it could experience too much pain, stress, or loss that causes them to struggle cognitively and emotionally. I didn't realize that that was a thing. But so, in the injuries of trauma, the first category of symptoms are re-experiencing or intrusive symptoms. That's where we think about things that we don't want to think about. We remember things that we don't want to remember, and we very often have dreams that are very upsetting or disruptive to our sleep or to our emotions. The trauma, the dreams can often relate very specifically to the trauma, or have other, kind of weird combinations of fears and cognitions. But re-experiencing or intrusive symptoms come out of the blue, or they come in response to triggers. And triggers can be really anything in the environment that connects to a memory or experience. Data gets imprinted on certain types of experiences, and so we know that something that we hear, something that we smell, this is something that the data gets coupled with. And so, you can remember certain experiences, from when you were young, with certain music or with certain smells. And certainly trauma is that way. And so we can be doing fine one minute, and then we have a trigger, and then all of a sudden our mood or our emotions, or even, where we're at in time has changed. And so this certainly causes disruptions to our mood and our focus and our ability to kind of pay attention to what's going on sometimes. And the next set of symptoms is called hyperarousal, also known, as hypervigilance. And this symptom, if the first category of symptoms is more cognitive and emotional, it's kind of from the chin up, then this is the physical experience of trauma. This is how trauma continues to leave a lasting impact on our physical presence. And so hypervigilance has to do with that exaggerated startle response that we mentioned before. It has to do with feeling physically amped up, anxious, nervous, jittery. Our muscles can change and have tension. Our heart, will often beat harder, more beats per minute. Shifting of the bowels, changes in body temperature, and certainly becoming overstimulated easily is something we see a lot with hypervigilance, becoming hypersensitive. Hypersensitivity means that a loud noise was a deafening noise, or a really, really frightening noise. It really heightens how we experience something emotionally and physiologically. But hyperarousal, hypervigilance, that can come out of the blue, or again in response to triggers. I remember I used to hear the screech of tires, and that would cause my stomach to just shrink up after I'd been in a wreck. I remember that had that effect for a long time. So, and it's a non-conscious response. It wasn't like, I remember that happening to me, I'm going to react. Pain causes us to react unconsciously. If you set your hand on a burner and you think, oh gosh, I'm burning my flesh, I probably need to stop doing that. And no, you react, it's pain. There's a signal that goes thousands of miles through your nerve system to your brain that says, don't do that because you're hurting yourself. And so you don't think about how to pull away from the pain, you just do it. And so that's one of the things that we see. So that leads us to avoidance and numbing. Avoidance is the root word, to avoid. People naturally avoid pain. People, places, or things that are scary or uncomfortable or painful for them. People are going to avoid those situations, and again, they're going to do that subconsciously. So we don't always think about, gosh, I'm hurting right now. What's the best way to feel some relief? People just withdraw from pain. And so now I will say that we all do some avoiding, and we all check out sometimes, and I think that's okay. I think we probably all need some a break. We all need a vacation, a dissociation, whatever. But when it happens too often is when it becomes disruptive. And any avoidant mechanism, if we, in excess, becomes detrimental or harmful in some way. If you go to the gym too much, you are, if you are actually working out when you're there, you're more than likely going to wear out parts of your body. Or on the other hand, you're also more than likely avoiding other important roles or tasks. If you can go see too many movies, read too many books, go on too many vacations, because that means you're going to be neglecting other parts of your life. And you can work out too much. You can work at your job too much. And I think for many of us who are very called to our work, and many of us have roles that have us working long hours, it can be really easy to work too much and then to avoid with work. And but then also we do know that people who have traumatic injuries are going to be at greatly increased risk for different types of addictions and different type of compulsive behaviors, because we know that trauma is an injury, and we're going to talk more about that. But injured people do injured things that try not to feel those injured feelings. And so again, if you have more headaches or back aches or physical pain, you're going to take more Tylenol or whatever painkiller that's necessary. And emotional pain is very similar. And so that's going to give us more to avoid, more to try to stay away from. And again, people don't always think, I'm in crisis, I'm in pain, what's the best and most healthy and responsible way to manage my pain? No, people just want help. People just want out. They just want relief. We do see that avoidance, numbing, dissociation, emotional numbing has to do, from what I'm observing, when people have needs, they need and need and need, and that need goes unaddressed long enough, a lot of needs become numb. And so a lot of kids are growing up neglected, not having healthy emotional bonds and connections with a loving parent or other caring adult. And so, and kids do need love. And their ability to connect with their parent certainly is going to translate later into their ability to connect with their peers and other people out in the world, because and a lot of kids are growing up, they still have social needs, but they're lacking the ability to meet those. And so emotional numbness and then dissociation. And so, well, it's kind of like going into shock. When we're hurt too badly, our system will kind of shut down to protect us in some ways. And so dissociation, again, that's a good thing that happens for us when we're too overwhelmed, when we're too much danger, when the pain is too great. I was in a motorcycle accident as a kid and had bones poking out and everything. And as soon as I sat up to prove to myself that I was okay and I saw that I wasn't, I passed out. The pain was too great and the shock was too much for what I was seeing at the time. And so that was a self-protective mechanism. And so now if my body had to go there very often, then it certainly would have been a bad thing. I would probably had lots of scars and bones poking out, and that would have been a bad deal. But again, dissociation keeps happening when we're no longer in the threat or the danger or the injury, and then it becomes disruptive. Then we lose minutes. Then we dissociate and we forget where we are at times. So again, avoidant mechanisms become problematic when they're repeated again and again and again, because that develops, an injury in our brain where addiction becomes a whole new injury. So, fear, distrust, shame, and guilt, those are the last two categories of post-traumatic stress symptoms. Fear and distrust. We know that post-traumatic stress is in the class of anxiety disorders. And we also see a lot of extremes. People who have been hurt a lot either trust no one and they build up their walls to keep everyone away, and they do that in a lot of different ways. or they trust everyone, and they allow people to keep coming in to hurt them again and again. And so shame and guilt is something that we see, we do see with trauma. It causes us to almost have this magical or irrational sense of guilt sometimes, as if we could have prevented things that we couldn't have predicted or known that were coming. A lot of times they also call that or compare it to survivor's guilt. That's when obviously when somebody makes it through a bad thing that others did not. We see that a lot with war veterans and with police officers. If one guy makes it and the other guy doesn't, that's obviously going to be something that, people struggle with. But it's almost like I should have been able to stop that bullet, or I should have been able to, and again, we start holding ourselves to account in ways that are, not always rational. And so one of the things that we see also with kids, injuries in kids and grown-ups, injured people do injured things, and injured behavior, especially in kids, resembles what kind of behavior? Bad behavior, delinquent behavior, criminal behavior. And of course, when you call it bad, if you call behavior bad, it's not very scientific, certainly, but we're kind of qualifying or giving ourselves permission to judge it, to criticize it, to punish it, to shame it. And so a lot of little ones are hurt, and they're injured, and it's just been normalized within their families, and then they go out into the communities and they do what their feelings tell them to do and what their norms and instincts and influences have taught them to do, and then they're in trouble, and then they're told that they're bad, and it kind of confirms what they were already feeling. And so we have to help the world understand the injuries of trauma, and those of us who must go and engage and try to take care of the injured people, we must understand these injuries before we interact, because it's not about 2 minutes of interaction with us. They may be very injured with us, and we've got to care anyway. We've got to protect and serve anyway, even if they hurt our feelings, even if they're somebody that, is acting in a way that we don't approve of, because injured people do injured things. We don't see the injuries. We don't see the things that happen to the kids. We just see them acting out in the community. A lot of times they grow up and they're not cute anymore, but it started very young for a lot of them. And so my buddy Robert here, he's going to come on and talk to you about some brain stuff. We're going to show you some brain slides. But I want you to look at that brain that shows a traumatized brain and a brain that hasn't been so affected by chronic stress or injury, because there is a difference. And people, human beings, we don't walk around with brain scanners and with heart monitors on. When I was the kid, had my leg broken from that motorcycle accident, the doctors told my family I might be hard to live with for a while. He's pretty banged up. And I was in a lot of pain and immobilized, a lot of things were happening. And I was hard to live with for a while. And I think for the most part, people were patient with me because I was so obviously injured. People didn't expect me to keep up the race with everybody else. I got to have some time to heal. And a lot of times when we don't see the injury, when it's not on the outside, we don't get time to heal. We're expected to keep up with the race with everybody else, and when we're not able to, we're judged, punished, fired, locked up. A lot of different things happen to us because we're injured, and people don't understand that. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Robert, and you can talk about some brilliant brain stuff.
Thanks, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
Part of the reason that we wanted to be able to bring all this information in is to make that connection between how humans develop and the work that we do. And one of the main things back in 1980, when I was first starting out in the business, we didn't have sophisticated CT scans or other kind of scans that actually showed what was going on in the brain, that could actually measure it at the very moment of occurrence. So if you look at the slide, you'll see that the brain has several different lobes. The frontal lobe is where we process information. That's where we make what we call executive functioning occurs. So critical decision making is a part of that part of the brain. We store memories there, and the different parts of the brain, the different lobes of the brain work together. And so the frontal cortex got a lot of attention because of the purpose that it serves, which is to process information. But the other parts of the brain are equally important. One of the things that we often ask is, when do you think that the brain finishes functioning, or finishes development? And we used to think it was around 18, 19, 20 years old. Now we know it's between 25 and 30. So when you're encountering people in the community who are under 25, or 25 and under, even under 30, you may be encountering someone who actually hasn't finished developing their brain. So the critical functioning, the executive functioning that we talk about, is occurring in that front lobe of the brain. Now, another part of the brain is the temporal lobe. If you look at that at the screen that shows the different lobes, the temporal lobe is the one where we process memories, where memories get stored initially in the hippocampus. So short-term memory occurs there, and it's at night during sleep, when we have our rapid eye movement sleep, that the transfer of those short-term memories to the frontal cortex occurs. In fact, we can now see through brain scans that there are micro flashes from the hippocampus that actually transfer that data to the front part of the brain, so that we'll have access to it the next day. If we have disrupted sleep, which was one of the symptoms of trauma, then that can interfere in the ability of the brain to move that data that we got the day before from one part of the brain to the other. So we need to be able to have good diet, good exercise, and we need to be able to get a good night's sleep in order to have adequate functioning. So if you look at the next slide, you'll start getting an idea of what we now know is an important part of understanding brain function. And you can see that there are differences, very dramatic differences, in the areas of functioning with the brain between a person who has not experienced trauma and one who has experienced trauma. So those are both CT scans and PET scans. So at those scans, it kind of gives you an idea of the difference between the functioning of a healthy brain and one that's been injured. And that's, Jeremy said it, and I'll say it again, injured people do injured things. So hurt people, we did training, one of the individuals that trained us, Dr. Sandy Bloom, is a psychiatrist who worked in a adult psychiatric facility in Pennsylvania. And she developed the model that we ended up adopting at the Oklahoma Youth Center, which is called the Sanctuary Model. And she was one of the first ones that introduced us to the idea that hurt people, hurt people. So generally, if you're not an injured person, yeah, we can have episodes of anger, but people who are injury, people who are traumatized and hurt in that way, can do different things, and because their brain is functioning differently than a normal person's brain. So keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the slides. We're going to talk later about generational trauma, and we'll tell you about a study that has been done that shows another effect of memory and functioning that can affect us generationally. And so keep that in mind as we proceed.
So we've got to practice not to punish. We've got to keep that on our mind. Being mindful means that we're thinking about things and we're doing each of the things that we do with purpose. You know, you can Google being mindful, and it's one of those kind of therapeutic terms, but you know, they did a study of mindfulness with train conductors in Japan, and the mindfulness, all they did was, I'm grabbing this lever, which does this, and they would speak the action and they would point to it as they did it. making themselves ultimately conscious of their actions. And it reduced errors by 50%. It reminded them what each task was and what it was for. And so when we offer interventions for therapy or for policing or for education, it really is about what their needs are. Now, sometimes an injured person does need to be removed from the community, and they do have to have different types of help, and for the safety of all. If someone is a danger to themselves or others, it's important that we get them somewhere that's not around others. And so that's the need for treatment centers, jails, prisons. I get it and I agree. But it is got to be about the needs of that person, that individual in our community, and not about our feelings. Because when it gets about our feelings, we start doing it because they pissed us off or because we don't like their kind of people. And we got to be careful with that, because it's not about our feelings, it's about their needs. Injuries in disguise. So again, just I won't beat the dead horse too much, but again, aggression, addiction, these are maladaptive coping mechanisms. These are survival mechanisms. Human beings are very adaptable, and I defined adaptation or is a developmental flexibility. We have to flex sometimes with our environment to be okay in that environment, or it breaks us. So a lot of our kids are growing up in environments of dysfunction where they just breathe in the environmental norms and dysfunctional norms. And that's what they know, and that's what they interact with. And sometimes to be in dysfunction, you have to kind of become that. People who've been at war say that, it's different there. What happens in war is different, and the rules of war are different. When people are engaging in, life or death battle, the etiquette and some of the rules of, civil society certainly probably have to go out the window. But so we have to understand that these injured behaviors are communicating something. We have to look at nature as a life as a nature show. Because human behaviors are communicating needs and injuries, instincts, norms, the things that they've been programmed with. So again, what's the second bullet on this one, Travis?
Human behavior communicating.
Yeah. So that's what I thought it was. But it reminds me of when you watch the nature, the Animal Planet or the Science Channel, when they actually have some rare nature on, and usually it has a British narrator. And he's telling you, here we have the young males grappling for dominance among the herd. Well, all behavior communicates something. And so we have to remember to kind of be scientists of people, on the job active sociologists, because now I don't want you guys, and gals, in life or death situations to be pondering too much. That's not what I challenge you to do. But as in the in-between moments, as you reflect on why people do what they do, we have to recognize that some of these have been long ingrained patterns of development, taught out of necessity, out of norm, out of injury, and out of need. What's the last couple of bullets?
Relief and support.
Yeah, so relief and support. That's one of the other things. You guys get called out on a lot of service calls for, Lord knows all the different things that the stories that my officer friends can tell. My goodness. But again, when people are hurting, the greatest needs that they have, when people are struggling and in crisis, I've observed again and again working in crisis care and in outpatient, is people need to feel better, and then they need people. People need coping, and they need caring. They need relief, and they need connection. Because human beings, we are social, emotional creatures. So we don't just need food, shelter, and clothing. We need somebody to care when we're hurting. So when we show up and somebody's not acting the way that they're supposed to do, granted, we've got to help restore order, but we've also got to recognize there's a human being there. And so I've got a slide that I'm going to show you later that it always just kind of hits home for me, so anyway, next is ACEs, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so I have a book that I'm hoping to finish one of these days called Aces, Injuries, and Healing. But I'll go ahead and teach about it now because it takes forever to work full time and then get your book out too. But ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences or Traumas. And there's lots of different things that can be traumatic to the growing child. And human beings are all different. So there are some standards that will be traumatic for all of us, and resilience, all kinds of different factors. Some kids do better with their trauma than others, and there's reasons for that as well. But I want to tell you guys a little bit about this study. And so in the ACEs study, this was actually done by a group, Insurance and Medical Research Hospital, Kaiser Permanente, and so also done with the CDC. And so they study, Vincent Felitti, you guys can look it up, ACEs study, lots of information on it. It's an ongoing study and they're still accumulating data, but they studied 17,000 medical records from birth to death. And I will note that these were typically middle-class people with private insurance. And so they studied these folks. Like I said, they weren't going to homeless shelters and county jail. These were teachers, nurses, doctors, and accountants, probably police officers as well. But 17,000, it probably had a little bit of everything. But 17,000 medical records from birth to death. And it showed that the more ACEs that you had, the more adverse childhood experiences you had, the more bad things that happen to you when you're little and you can't do or protect or defend or provide for yourself, is the shorter that your life is. And notably more miserable and much more suffering along the way as well. And so I think it's also interesting to note that this study was not initially founded in studying trauma. They weren't going out there to dig into childhood trauma. They were actually studying obesity and the way that people eat and struggle with weight. And so I think that's really, really interesting as well. But a lot of people were entered this study and they lost weight in a weight loss program, and then when they graduated the program, they gained the weight back, and they puzzled over that. Why are they doing that? So they studied it. They looked into a lot of different factors, jobs and demographics, but also they looked into background. And some of those included negative and adverse things happening. And so in a huge battery of all kinds of different assessments, they found the thing that kind of popped up in common was childhood trauma. But think about that. The childhood trauma. So I'm going to actually show you guys now the 10 ACEs. So, and I won't, go over these, and you can read. But these are one thing that I will note. These are things like physical and emotional abuse. These are things like sexual abuse. These have to do with the stability of the parent, a mental illness, a significant or suicidality or addiction or domestic violence. And so again, I want to note that we know danger exists in the world. We teach our kids to watch out for strangers and that there's bad guys out there. But it does a special kind of harm to us when it's happening to us in our safe place, when we're supposed to be able to be safe. And so, as Robert noted, our brain takes 25 years at least to grow and develop. And so trauma's bad after you're 25, but your brain's a bit more equipped. You have a bit more words to put to it to understand your experience and how it's affected you. But when you're little, it can become quite normalized. I had a 15-year-old kid. He had really high ACEs. I had to do trauma assessments on a couple thousand kids in my time at the Children's Hospital. Every kid that came in that was over a certain age, and he tested really high on ACEs. And I asked him, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Because we're supposed to assess him for future orientation. How well he's able to think about and plan for or hope for the future. And so he said, "Probably go to jail." He was 15. And so I said, "Gosh, man, why would you want to do that? The jail, You know, and I listed all the things, you know, I mean, food sucks, you're not free, you know, you have to crap in front of people. I mean, like, you know, there's all these things, you know, the possible sexual assault. There's a lot of bad stuff going on in jail. And he said, well, no, not necessarily. I don't want to go, but that's just what we do in my family. You know, and indeed, a lot of his key role models and influencers and teachers and providers and here's where you live and where I provide for you, that was gone. You know, he was a system kid. And so there's a lot of kids growing up with what I call dysfunctional norms or detrimental familiarities. You know, so many kids are not given so much of a chance because, you know, our brain is going to soak up whatever data it has access to, and that's foundational data. But there are some things that we know about resilience with kids and having 1, 2, or more caring adults that do help anchor a kid, that help a kid anchor themselves and that take an active interest in the kid, that holds them accountable. And because we teach kids how to care about themselves. You know, we put, you know, pennies into that little piggy bank that gives them emotional currency later. I like that. You know, because emotional currency, we teach kids how to feel and we pour into them, and that gives them the ability to care about themselves and about others. That we have to give them that capacity. They have to have somebody that, you know, cares if they show up. Somebody that they don't want to let down other than themselves. And so I remember when I was a kid, I had a couple of friends that had no rules, no curfew, and I thought, oh, what a life. What a life that would be. I have to be home when the street lights, and if I spend the night with somebody, they're going to check and make sure that that's really where I'm going. And, you know, woo, kind of got past that a couple of times. But anyway, so I remember one night, I was like, oh, man, I got to hit it, buddy. I'm going to, you know, I got to be home or that's my ass. And so he said, yeah, I probably better get home too. And I said, cool, man, see you later. And I'm pedaling my bike down the road. And he said see you later. He was going to head home too. And I looked, and he was just pedaling in a little circle. When I got to the end of the street, he was just pedaling in a little circle. Nobody cared if he came home, you know. And no kids, you know, they don't have the ability to say, yeah, please give me, you know, love with curfew and structure and discipline and hold me accountable. They don't ask for these things, but they darn sure need them. And part of that means that somebody cared because, you know, a lot of the cool parents didn't put in the time or the effort, you know. And so we, you know, one of our initiatives is changing Oklahoma ACEs. The mission, I believe, of Evolution Foundation and of Newview Healing Solutions is to change Oklahoma ACEs because this means something to everybody. You know, the injured kids are going to school with the well kids. And they're being injured, and they're creating a risk. And again, we have a society, we're supposed to take care of all kids because they are our future. It's not just a song from the 80s. I believe the children are our future. You know, I mean, we all acknowledge that, but what are you going to do? Something. And again, you know, I get kind of preachy. You guys get up every day and give your something. And so what I just want to do is offer some emotional currency and knowledge to support you guys in what you do, because we need you. And it's, you know, a ridiculously hard job that most everybody in the world can't comprehend who's not done it. But again, I want to break down this ACE's pyramid of misery and show maybe where we can do something about it. Let's just break it down a little bit. There's a pyramid there, and the ACEs are at the bottom. The adverse childhood experiences, the injuries, the traumas. So that's where the pain started. And again, I want to also note, like I said earlier, if the car runs us over, then we're scared of the car. Or if we get in a car wreck, we're scared to ride in the car. The dog bites us, we're scared of the dog. We understand where that injury kind of comes from if it's a noticeable blip on the radar. But if everything's running us over and everything's biting us, then that's just kind of the way it is. That's the world, and it's not as noticeable. So that, I think, creates, you know, if you get a big injury and, ow, I'm hurt. You know, typically you want to do something about that. But if it's like, ow, I'm hurt again, what else is new? You see less need to address that, and there's probably less people around willing to help you address that. And so moving on up the pyramid, because again, injured people are going to have a higher need for relief. More pain equals more need. And so if they're getting their hand touched to the burner more often, then they're pulling away from the burner and reacting to pain a lot more often, both oftentimes physically and emotionally. And so that's where we see kids and teenagers and adolescents engaging in higher rates of addictive and compulsive behaviors. Certainly we know problems with eating, but also problems with experimentation with drugs, alcohol, tobacco. Now we got the vaping, and a lot more access to marijuana. Of course, and this is, I don't think, what any of the people who supported medicinal, legal, responsible use for adults, I don't think what's happening in our states, what any of those people intended. But anyway, that's another story. But again, these are injured people doing injured things that try not to feel their feelings. I had an uncle that served in the Vietnam War, and they would go out and, they would see their buddies get hurt. These booby traps that would impale people, people that were shooting at you. You were there and you didn't really understand, why you were there, but you were in danger and you didn't know when you got to go home. And when you would go on watch, you had to watch for danger and you had to be real still and real quiet. The fight, flight, or freeze response almost teaches us not to breathe. We're holding our breath, and our muscles are like this. And any little sound, any little creak in the twigs, any little shuffle here or there means danger. And so you become hyper alert, hyper aware, and then you get relieved, and then you go back to a tent, and then you get to rest. All right, you've been like this for 12 hours or however long. Now let your body rest. How easy is it to turn off that stress when you've done that for so long? And so, of course, readily available, they had alcohol, they had marijuana, they had opium and heroin. And so these guys, you just saw your buddy get really hurt, some killed, and you're worried about all these different things that the soldier must experience at war. And then you have these things that'll give you a little bit of relief, help you sleep at night, help your muscles and your shoulders that have been like this go, ah. And so one of the things is, when you're under fire in battle or emotionally, you go to the first place where you can get out of danger. If you went to a snake hole, and there wasn't no machine guns flying, but there was snakes in there trying to bite you, most soldiers would say they would, contend with the snakes. And so now the problem is, we see that people, it becomes, kind of instinctive because the brain remembers relief. Our brains were wired to avoid pain, seek pleasure. That's called the plain pain pleasure balance. It's kind of a pain pleasure balance. I need to say that a few times to get. But so our brains were wired in that way, and that makes a lot of sense. But people with more pain are going to seek more pleasure to balance that out, to seek more relief. And when you're under fire again, or when your post-traumatic symptoms creep up again, people don't often think, there's more symptoms flying, there's more bullets flying. Where's the best place to go? I know that snake hole wasn't going. That's the only place I know. So a lot of times people are going back to the same old maladaptive coping mechanism, those old coping traps that provide some often immediate gratification, a little bit of immediate relief, but then become a new injury in themselves. Because injured people do injured things that further injure themselves. So on up the pyramid, we do see that in adolescence, they're struggling more in school. And they're struggling more with health. They're struggling more academically and socially and with family. And a lot of when these are family kind of injuries, we understand why they're struggling in their families. And this leads to more mental health issues, more medical health issues, more kids dropping out or failing out of school, getting kicked out, higher rates of youth incarceration. We're seeing more addiction developing. We're seeing higher rates of sexually transmitted diseases, cancers, they're just all kinds of stuff. Diabetes, weight problems. The list goes on and on. Injured kids doing injured things to try not to feel their feelings. And we do see that leads to higher rates of addiction, incarceration, and early death. And indeed, we can look at someone's trauma history and without ever even knowing the human, these measures, we can predict within 90% accuracy what kind of problems they would develop in adulthood. And what that means to me when I think about it is this. Now, if one or two people had it rough, if everybody had it rough, let me say that again. If everybody had it rough and only a couple people struggled, then there must be something wrong with them. But this is what human beings do when placed in abnormally stressful, events with a lack of protection or unmet needs, especially in early development. So this really is an injury. And of course, when little boys and little girls grow up injured and they keep being injured, society often says, you got to go away, you're not cute anymore. And we understand the need for safety and order in our society. But I think if we approach it in a way that does help injured kids not end up in these situations, we've got to get there earlier. And it's going to take all of us. Again, if it's just the therapists, if it's just the police officers, if it's just the people who work with kids, we got to get everybody on board with changing ACEs, because it's just not right and it's not fair, and it's the detriment to our whole society. Because the kids that are depressed and suicidal and growing up, with access to guns and weapons and drugs and all kinds of negative ideas, they're sitting right next to our kids in class, So changing ACEs in Oklahoma is every safe adult's duty. And I'll reiterate that again and again. So I'm going to go over, again, just looking at the injuries of our state. We're an injured forest, and the trees we got injured trees falling all around us, and it's just kind of, yeah, I know, that's Oklahoma for you. But we're number one in heart disease death in the nation. Who wants that? Is that because we're dumb, or we just eat bad, or what? I mean, we're just injured. There's nothing better or worse about Oklahomans. I tend to think, we're pretty great. But here's some measurable facts, and I could give you a whole lot more. Now, we're number 2 in the nation for incarcerating men. And we're number 1 in the world for incarcerating women. We're number 1 in the world per capita for locking up mommies. Now, again, we have to understand the problem. I don't believe, by the time they get to where they're offending in the ways that they are, a lot of them do require just that. Now, and of course, we can get into how actually rehabilitational the prison system is. That's another discussion, though. But I don't think that we're so high-ranking in locking up our citizens, our brothers and sisters, because we've got more bad criminal people. We do have more injuries, and the ACEs and other measures do show it. And again, with looking at the history of trauma in our state, it's easy to see how it's just like, oh yeah, but it doesn't have to be this way, and it ought not. In order for us to have a better future, for us to be anything like a top 10 state, we've got to do better. And I want, it ain't about politics, but if it's about how you vote, Republican, Democrat, Independent, or whatever party, we've got to put people in there that care about the kids, that do more than show up to ribbon cutting ceremonies and say pretty words. We've got to, support people that support teachers, law enforcement, mental health, and children in order for us to have a future. So anyway, we're number 4 in divorces. We're number 4 in cancer. And again, we've got those ACEs. We got to do better, and again, it hurts my Okie pride to see us where we are. And I know, when you hear people in the nation talk about Oklahoma and all those worst and first facts, I know that doesn't, compliment your pride either. But again, that's why you get up and do what you do, because you have something. You know, you say, I'm going to do something about this. And we do too. And we support you. We support, you know, officers. You know, one of the things I find in this, I don't think this is going to be a controversial statement, but, you know, people use these letters BLM, and some people say that means Black Lives Matter, and some people say that means Blue Lives Matter, and I think it works pretty good for both, and I think we have to hold up the lives that are most endangered, and indeed, officers are very endangered. And so I'll proudly, you know, support both BLMs, you know, with pride and necessity, because I see both populations having some advanced dangers that the average American citizen does not. And so, you know, we've been talking about ACEs. I want to show you first of a couple of video clips that I learned to show in some training that I did some years ago, and I didn't mean to rhyme with that, but anyway, but it's from the movie Seabiscuit. It's a true story, and so this is an injured little horse, and it kind of rises to, you know, overcome some challenges and does some great things. And really, all of the main characters in this movie are traumatized and injured people. So I'll let you guys check that out and kind of watch for some of those ACEs, for some of those early childhood injuries that Seabiscuit experienced. Okay, so looking back, you know, over that clip, you know, again, I like showing video clips, and this, you know, this movie kind of just gets you right there, you know, even if you're not a horse person. But again, think about some of the different injuries that Seabiscuit experienced. Again, separated from mother at an early age, you know, sold. You know, I know we maybe be over empathizing a little bit with the horse, but you know, it was deemed that the horse was incorrigible, so they, you know, said hit him as many times as you can over the course of a mile. You know, and so of course they identified, you know, if we were clinicians and therapists, we would diagnose some symptoms. We see some, you know, we see some depression in the horse. We see that even though it's a small horse, it can eat a lot, and it likes to, you know, just, you know, lay about for hours under the trees. And so, again, by the definitions of a horse, you know, they're supposed to be big and strong and fast and fierce and productive, you know, by the, you know, terms of human beings, and of course. But like Tom said, you don't throw away a whole life just because it's banged up a little bit. And in our society, we can see that once people do become injured, and once people don't kind of fit the mold and keep up in the race and aren't sleek and beautiful, then just kind of like Seabiscuit, so many of our kids are doing exactly what we're training them to do. You know, when they get their chance to race, they do what we taught them to do, and they lost. And so that's kind of a powerful clip. So anyway, we'll check out some more Seabiscuit in a little while with some other information, because again, for me, it just hits home and helps illustrate stuff and lets you guys look at and hear something other than me and Robert. So family and generational trauma. You know, I think, you know, I've covered some of that, how kids become traumatized from generation to generation. I don't think families are growing up saying, yeah, I want to screw my kids up, see them suffer and end up bad. But a lot of families don't know any other way. And so thinking about think about the term generational trauma in and of itself. So when parents are not well, kids are not well. It affects a parent's ability to nurture and support and meet the needs of their kids. And it also, kids, when they see their parents hurting, or when parents are parenting injured. There's, I think, both direct trauma from being hurt by the injured behaviors, also, but it does a vicarious or secondary trauma to see our examples, to see our role models, to see the people who we look up to and learn from struggling, because it teaches struggle. And I think parents have to be genuine, and hopefully healthy in how they express emotions and cope with emotions, because that's teaching kids how to do it, one good or bad or ugly. And so we have to make sure, what we're attacking this problem from every angle, I guess. But thinking about generational trauma, there's been some interesting stuff learned about generational trauma that's going beyond just those impacts of direct and vicarious trauma. And this is more on a genetic and biological level. And of course, we know that mommies, when they're stressing or when they're physiologically struggling, that can affect baby growing up inside her. But also, it's appearing that some other things can kind of come into play. The trauma that we experience, or that previous generations have experienced, may affect through gene expression, generations in the future. We study mice a lot in the lab because their nervous system and brain, communicates with their body in such similar ways. And there was a study of mice where male mice were shocked, then exposed to cherry blossom smell, and they did this over and over again until it created an injury for the mouse. First, they had little mouse ulcers, and they were clearly afraid of the cherry blossom smell because they had formed an association. Shock 'em cherry, shock 'em cherry, shock 'em cherry. And so after a while, they didn't even have to shock them. Just letting them smell cherry, it freaked them out. And so now what's interesting and fascinating is they had these mice procreate and make pups. And I think that this was common only in the male mice. But Robert, do you remember male mice only?
Male. No.
So anyway, all the pups. Okay, so it was all the pups. For 3 generations, they were never exposed to the shock. So they fared a little bit better than their ancestors of mice. They didn't have the actual trauma, and yet when exposed to cherry blossom, they showed fear. Unexplainable fear that had no experiential data to compute or contribute. And so now, and by the way, they did some control against that experiment as well. So, by the way, of course, normal mice are not afraid of cherry smell. They were looking for cherry pie. Where's it at? They were not afraid of it. So it was clearly something that it was in their physiology somehow. And so the thing about that is, now they looked at their DNA, and the DNA had not been altered, but there is something, and we know this now through studies called epigenetics, that there are certain traits that can ride on top of, epi meaning on top of the gene. So that means certain traits are riding on top of our genes based on how they're being nurtured, or how they're being triggered, or how they're being traumatized. And so now I think that, now of course this gives me more questions than answers. We're not allowed to harm human beings and expose them to certain smells and then, see what happens to their grandkids. We're not really, that's an unethical study as far as human research is concerned. But we draw some, inferences from such data, and it causes us to question, because indeed, many of us do have it better than our ancestors did, and yet may have some unexplainable triggers. So I just think that's really interesting. It's the whole nature versus nurture discussion as well. Some people say we're made by our genetics, and others say no, it's our environment that makes us. And indeed, it's both, because the building blocks have to be there, but then our environment and the way we're provided for is going to shape those building blocks. So looking at injuries, creating unmet needs, because kids need safety. That's one of their most cardinal and imperative needs, because again, children's development can literally be put on hold. We see that trauma changes our brain, our heart, our nervous system in measurable ways. It's not just a metaphorical injury. You know, this is something that we can see. We showed you the brain scan earlier, but we can look at, where certain parts of our brain have become overdeveloped based on overstimulation. Our brain is activated by use, and when our stress responses are used more often, they become more developed, like we're working them out like our muscles. And if I work out my left arm more often, then it's becoming more developed, and it's going to be more prone to use. And if I do it too much, it may start spasming and wanting to work on its own sometimes. And that's what's happening with post-traumatic stress in kids and adults. Their stress response is continuing to activate when there's oftentimes no longer a stressor or trigger present. And so anyway, thinking about those injuries, that's oftentimes injuries and trauma in childhood can affect how tall a child becomes as an adult. When they hit puberty, it affects their breathing and heart rate and sleep, and so how much REM sleep they get. So there's a lot of different implications. I think it's really, really important for us to understand that it is not just a metaphorical injury. This is a physically, medically measurable injury that's not obvious. People don't walk around with brain scanners and heart monitors on, like I say. But these injured behaviors, unmet needs, do lead us to engage in other injured behaviors to try to meet those needs, because we know something's missing sometimes, or we don't always consciously know it, but we go in seek of what we need sometimes. And so that's why it's so, injured kids are at a great risk to fall into groups of other injured kids doing injured things. And then they be injured together. So we do see higher rates, first, earlier and more frequent sexual relationships, problematic peer groups, gang involvement. And of course, we know kids aren't supposed to have sex before they're too, young, before they're too old, and they're not supposed to do drugs. They're supposed to say no to drugs, and they're certainly not supposed to engage in, gang activity, crime, violence. We know these things, but they're doing them because a lot of kids don't have a present family that's able to teach them and meet those needs. Because kids do have needs for not just food, shelter, and clothing. They need love. They need attention. They need structure and discipline, not punishment for being injured, but they need discipline that teaches them when you do wrong, there's going to be some things that happen. Not because we're mad at you, and we get mad at kids sometimes, but anyway, they need these things, and they need to feel a sense of acceptance, a sense of belonging. We all need to belong to something, a family first, and then our peer group. And so when you don't have that sense of belonging and acceptance and meeting those key social emotional needs at home, we find it in our peers. And so, and again, the kids who are struggling are not finding the A students and the honor roll kids and the fellowship of student athletes to hang out with. They're finding other kids that they can identify with that say, that don't make them feel weird for being hurt. And then you get together and they do other things. And of course, it's sometimes harder to mess up on your own, but if you have others to nod heads and smile along and say, yeah, cool, it makes it, easier to screw up and to engage in those injured behaviors. But, thinking about gang activity in specific, there was a guy from Oklahoma City, I forget his name, he went out and studied gang activity in Compton, California, with the hopes of helping kids get out of gangs. And he didn't go tell them, you need to get out of gangs. Don't you know that's bad for you? It's crime. It's against the law. They know that. But they started to interview kids who would be willing to talk to them and say, well, what's it mean? Tell me about your world. I don't understand that. They used a process of what I would call cultural humility, we recognize that this is not our world. And so to immediately cast judgment upon it, is not helpful. We've got to try to connect before we control or manage or intervene. And I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But these kids helped kind of describe what it meant to be on the set and to do all these different things. And he says, so is that a good thing or a bad thing about different gang processes? Because a lot of these kids as early as 11 or 12 or 13 years old had an addicted parent or a mentally ill parent at home. There was poverty rampant, in any community. If there's not enough, of the basics, then people are going to struggle and grapple, for the resources that are there. And that does lead to dysfunction and crime. But anyway, a lot of these kids were helping us realize that they were getting food from their gangs. They were being a part of a group going down that street in that hood made you safer. So to just tell a kid, get out of the gang. If you get out of the gang, if you say, I'm no longer with you guys, that usually means you're a snitch, you're a narc. And that's not safe. And so we don't understand the world that sometimes that we intervene in. So we have to be, I think, culturally humble and recognize that if we connect with them and help them understand, ways to do it healthier, to meet some of these needs, because human needs continue. These needs persist. And so if we just tell them they're bad for having those needs in a place where the world is not saying, here, I love you, come have some food and some safety. That's not the world these kids are growing up in. Normally we do this, discussion live and in person with our officer friends. And I want to reiterate that we'll come and do that with you if you want us to, for free. So I guess we'll make this a little bit more rhetorical. And we certainly welcome questions or comments that you could, I guess, send via email. And we may even look into doing some live chat. So if we do have this posted for a live chat at some point, then this would be a point where you tell us what injured behaviors you're seeing. What bad, what injured, what unstable, what criminal behaviors are you most commonly intervening with? So you can share with us, abiding by any rules of confidentiality that you must abide by, certainly. Or you can just think about it to yourself rhetorically for a moment. What do you see most of? And so, if this was a human nature show, what are those behaviors attempting to communicate? That's my worst, British accent ever. But think about that. Rhetorically, you probably see a lot of domestic violence, a lot of substance issues. And so we have to also recognize that when kids are growing up injured with more of those needs, they're being taught to be injured, and everybody in the world says, we've got the answer. We've got something that'll help you feel better, and it's drugs, it's alcohol, it's vaping, it's gaming, there's just so many different things that are waiting out there to externally fix you. And so again, they keep going back to the snake holes over and over again, and they keep engaging in those injured behaviors. So anyway, again, I just I honor and support my officer friends, men and women in law enforcement who go out there and get spit at and get yelled at and cursed at for showing up to intervene. Because we don't typically go door to door asking for, hey, anybody need some law enforcement? Anybody need some therapy? Anybody need some services? We don't do that. We're called upon. And then sometimes we're treated kind of like we're the bad guy. And we've still got to find a way to show love to our community, of course, which you guys and gals do, I know. But it's hard. One of the things that, a saying that it came to me like I was waking up one morning, and love applied logically is always the answer. Love, it's a thing. It's, love is all you need, John Lennon said, and the Bible, and it's just this thing that repeats over and over in our culture, in our society. It bonds us together. But love must be applied logically, because when love is applied logically, it's always the answer. In interpersonal human issues, in business, in economics, in politics, if we can just show one another love like we're supposed to. Anyway, love is all you need. But I show love to my officer brothers and sisters because you guys are injured. You fall under scrutiny for all the bad stuff that, the worst among our humanity. There are bad examples of every profession, and law enforcement does offer that as well. And so you catch scrutiny and stress for that, and you are looked upon with judgment and fear by others. And also, you get hurt doing what you do. You get stabbed, you get shot at, you get punched and kicked and bitten and all of those things. And that's stressful. So and a lot of times, officer friends will say, well, it's great, to have time to debrief and process and think about it, but it's one call after another. You guys don't have enough law enforcement, enough funding, enough resources to truly meet the needs that you're called upon to meet in your communities very often. And so, and when you give your best every day, day in and day out, and it's still, the world is overwhelming with problems when it seems like your best isn't enough. We see injured kids all the time. And of course, in my work, we want to heal the world, change the world, make the world a better place, like you guys do. And when you help another one get well, and then there's 10 behind it with the same or worse problems, it can wind you down and give you some compassion fatigue, or it can numb you to the problems of the world. And so we do see a lot of PTSD and chronic stress problems with officers because of the job that you do. And again, most people may get yelled at a time or two in their life, hopefully, if ever, or get into a physical altercation a very limited number of times in their life. This is something you guys do all the time. So there's some danger in the normalization of your danger. And so there's that. So we do see higher rates of depression and anxiety. Post-traumatic stress is an anxiety disorder. We do see higher rates of suicide among officers who were harmed repeatedly from their work. And this is, again, why I go over this, because your work does put you at particular vulnerability. There is a lot of emotional contagion. You're engaging with a lot of injured people as well. And so domestic violence. It's hard to turn violence off sometimes when you've had to be again, the rules of war are different. The rules of war are different. So, and when you're at war, you're usually away, hopefully from the mainland, and you're somewhere else, and then you have a debriefing time, and there are processes to remind you how to get back to civilian life. And I'm not a part of that world, so I don't know how adequate those are, but there is a process and a time for that. But you guys go right home. You're soldiers by day, and you're civilians by night, or whenever your off shift is. And making that transition, I can see how it wears on the mind, and on the, it's kind of hard to turn that off sometimes. And so, but reminding us that we, are in a violent world sometimes. It does have an impact on our norms for violence, our reactions, and our reactivity to others. So understanding that injured police officers puts us at risk of doing some injured policing. And so I do believe that all human beings make mistakes, and our user error, our operator error, our errors in practice of any profession are going to go up when we're struggling emotionally and when we're not at our best. And so this is a bigger issue. We need police departments and administrations to understand the injuries of their officers. There are probably some that are doing a better job and some that are not doing as good a job. But I say across the board, everybody needs more support for the job that you guys do. because I don't pretend to understand. Therapists, I think in therapy school 20 years ago, they used to teach you to scratch your chin and nod and say, I understand, tell me more. Well, we don't get it, and I'm not pretending to. But I will, say that if you don't acknowledge your own injuries, if they've become so normalized, then you're very much like a lot of the injured kids that grew up that just were taught not to do anything about it and just keep being injured and doing injured. And of course that does shorten officers' life. It shortens their time in their profession, and it shortens their time in their bodies on planet Earth. And so, I'm not one of these guys that's going to have us all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and cry gently on each other's shoulder. But if we don't acknowledge what's happening when there's too much electricity happening and shocking our brain from our own nervous system, and having too much of those neurochemical responses in our brain and body, we can acknowledge it or not, but it is harming us. And so, my hat's off and my heart's out to our officers, men and women that do this work with your injuries. Because, again, thinking about that pain-pleasure balance, our brains are wired to avoid pain, seek pleasure. Your job's teach you how to go towards the pain. So that's going to also put you at greater risk for substance abuse and also maladaptive and addictive compulsive behaviors, because again, the human body and brain doesn't say, I'm really in crisis, I'm really struggling emotionally right now. What's the best and most rational way to handle that? We pull away from the pain. And you guys have pain to deal with. And so suppressing it and acting like you don't have those needs, it can put you at a lot of risk for harm in a lot of different ways, for physiological harm, but for social and emotional harm in your families, divorce rates, families splitting up, it's a lot of, I think it's just unfair that kids are injured so often when they can't do much about it, and I think it's just really unfair that officers are so injured when they're trying to just be the good guys. So we want to find, I don't have all the answers or solutions. I don't pretend to, but we want to contribute, and we want to put some currency in your bank. What's next? One of the things that I'm not going to shy away from is the tough to discuss topics. And one of the things that has become a bit unpopular is to look at history lessons here lately. And so I do think it's wrong for people to put their spin on it. The 24-hour news networks on both sides of the fence that read the news in very passionate, or some of it probably isn't even news, in very impassioned and inflamed tones. Anytime that somebody gets too pumped up about information or quasi-information or alleged information that they share with you, their emotions are telling you how to feel about that as well. So we have to, be careful about that. But I think it's important for us to recognize, in the earlier portion of the presentation, we were talking about foundations of traumatic history and how we came to understand the injuries of trauma. And I think in all respects, we have to understand foundationally how we came to be where we're at in any number of things. And so, now, policing was started in places like New York because of high rates of crime and violence. And so, and we can all nod our heads and agree we need police to help us intervene, control, and regulate crime and violence. But we also have to acknowledge that some policing was enacted to help regulate and control slaves. And we know that this was a brutal practice of ownership of people, for which a whole group of states was willing to secede from the nation. They wanted to start their own country, and they say, well, it was just about the Southern way of life. It wasn't about, but it was predicated on the fact that they wanted to have their own country that said you could own little boys and little girls and grow them up and work them to death and beat them and rape them and do all these things to them with impunity. And slaves did try to escape their torture. They did try to reunite with their families. and there were police forces enacted to round them up and capture them. And of course, if you saw a black person, unattended to, you were supposed to shake them down and check them out. And so, again, we didn't do that. We weren't around for these foundations. We wasn't there when the natives were chased off of their land. We wasn't there when Africans were sold into slavery. We weren't a part of that. But we have to recognize the echoes that has and the lingering impacts that has. And so, because we learned from someone who learned from someone who learned from someone who learned from someone. And so there have been some racist practices in the practice of law enforcement and in maintaining order. And so, again, we can't really knock the officers for doing their job, because the law of the land was that slavery was allowed. The ownership of human beings was allowed in that time. And if the law of the land was that, these guys were responsible for upholding the law. So that's what I think about. Isn't law a funny thing? I used to, when I was a little kid, I thought about law as this concrete, this thing. It was like almost ordained by the universe and by God. But law is just made by people. Because you can see that because they change. That's just made by people. So traditionally, we know that when there was the African American people were freed as slaves, they were separate but unequal, and Jim Crow and redlining districts, and some of those practices have persisted to this day. Black people were not allowed to live outside of certain communities. We're not allowed loans in certain communities because they were to be contained in areas that were underserved and under-resourced. Because I got a couple of dogs that love each other over there, and I'm not comparing any human beings to dogs, but I guess in a way that I am, because any species or race of people, or any species of animal, if there's not enough food, my dogs who love each other, if there's food in one bowl and not food in the other, and I've been gone, the dogs will snap at each other if they go to the bowl sometimes. And so we see that in certain communities, higher rates of crime and violence. So, and of course, people who didn't want to see African Americans do well said, well, see, I told you so. Look at those people in that community. And so, what's and traditionally, thinking about the generational trauma, you guys didn't inflict all of this generational trauma, but we also have to recognize that if some of the previous generations or family members have been harmed by anyone that looks or sounds like you, that wears a badge, then maybe it's not a cherry blossom, it's a badge. Maybe it's a black and white, and so and recognizing that fear and hypersensitivity can cause some irrational responses in that population. And one of the things that we do see increasingly, and officers are starting to be held to account for the actions of their fellow officers. And so and there's a lot of debate about whether that should or shouldn't be, but there has been the code of silence, and there has been some instances of loyalty to our own over the community. And there's that, and there are things that if we wouldn't want the community to know, then that would seem to be a problem. Whenever we lack transparency, certainly even if there's nothing going on, that can lend to some suspicion. But if we're more loyal to our own group than we are to the communities that we serve, then that becomes highly problematic. And I do get the need for loyalty and having one another's back. That's life or death. Those bonds that thicker than water. I get that too. But no one can be above whatever the law of the land is. And so anyway, recognizing that policing started for the reasons that it started for what that it's needed for. is to control crime and violence. And just like any good and necessary thing, or well, the Bible, you know, I grew up reading the Bible and loving the Bible, and I you know, I still, you know, have love for the Bible. And people have manipulated the Bible. You know, they use terms and passages from the Bible to justify slavery. You know, they said that those were not human beings, they were animals. And, you know, man, us white folks, were given domain of all the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the beasts of the field. And those black people were termed beasts. And what do you do with beasts? You can own them. What do you do with bad people? You lock them up. And so the Bible was misused, and the police officers were misused. So again, I'm not knocking you guys, but if we're ones that we hear some of these terms and we start getting our dander up and we're saying, you know, I'm not going to hear it, because indeed, if you're one that says the way we do it's perfect and there's nothing that can be better, that there's no improvements that can be made, and everybody that's out to get us is wrong, and you're part of the problem, you know. And those, I believe the people that think that we're perfect and they're perfect and there's nothing they can do to be better in their work, I think those are probably pretty few and far between. We all recognize our human fallibility, but for those of us that don't look to say, we can find a better way, we haven't gotten there yet. But for those who are not looking to find a better way and to say that you know, we don't need to do a better job, people need to just get off our back, I think that's part of the problem. I'm pretty darn good at what I do, but I know I need to keep getting better, because people live and die based on what I teach them and the therapy I do with them and the interventions that I call in for them. And so I got to keep getting better. If I don't stay on top of my game, if I don't keep moving forward, then I'm going to stagnate, I'm going to move backward, and I'm going to become more injured by my work. I'm going to talk a little bit more about race stuff, you know, you know, as I've had some of these discussions, I thought to myself, I had a little anxiety, you know, going into a room of police officers in 2022 or 21 when we were last doing it, and talking about race. And I thought to myself, should I be talking about this? Heck yeah, I should be talking about this. You know, you all are the brave people. And I consider in my work, I want to be one of the brave people like y'all. And so we take on the challenging stuff. And so in talking about race, I think we break it down and look about where it comes from and what it is. And so racism comes from tribalism. It comes from the fact that we used to only be in groups together that pretty much of groups that looked like us, sounded like us, had similar practices to us. And so in ancient times, if a group of other people were coming towards you that looked different than you, you had cause for concern. And so we understand some of perhaps the more ancient and instinctive roots of being concerned about somebody who looks and sounds different than us. Now in current times it has less relevancy. And so I think that, well, everybody's probably got a little bit of racism in them, or at least has been impacted by that. And so I think we have to look for those impacts, you know, because there's a lot of people who say, well, I'm not racist, I just don't see why those people ... Fill in the blank, you know. And so understanding, I think there's certain indicators, because part of being moral and just and justice for all, you know, the American way, you know, is looking to see how we can overcome some of our own personal influence. Because I got news for you, I can't help who I learned from. I didn't get to decide the people who programmed my brain. But when I can recognize that there was some problematic programming, I get to challenge that. I don't get to just say, yep, that's just the way I learned. And the way I learned and where I come from is the best. And the way everybody else learned from other places and other ways of thinking is wrong. Because it's not my way of thinking. And so if we are willing to, you know, there are certain deficits. You know, people have problems. You know, we're messed up sometimes. We make mistakes. We're fallible. But if we are naturally going to attribute a human deficit to to their color or to their race or to their gender or something else, then again, like I said, then you might be you have an impact from racism. And I think that we have to recognize that racism, when used in modern context, is a tool. It's an evil tool. It was used, again, to justify the theft of this continent. And again, we didn't do that. So I'm not saying we all pack up, head back to Europe. We're all here now. But the thing is, Caucasian Europeans wouldn't naturally coexist with indigenous peoples and African peoples all on a continent. We're here though now. We get to make the best of it or not, But the fact is, Hitler and his Germany, he said that Jews were less than and justified the Holocaust and atrocities, and again and again. And so one of the things that I just really want to point out, because I feel like our officer friends are put in harm's way unnecessarily too often. And I thank you, men and women, for going and answering the call when you're asked to do so. And we hope that you're only asked to do so when necessary. But it reminds me of the Civil War, because the guys who fought in the Confederate Army, they didn't own slaves. And the guys who owned slaves didn't fight in the Confederate Army. Typically, there was a few. There was the rare example. But people who owned plantations and didn't work on their own plantations, who made other human beings work and supplied them with their wealth, they didn't fight and die for that cause. They sent the poor boys to do that. And they convinced the poor boys that this was a cause that was just. Those black people are not real people. They're bad, and they're going to do bad things to your women. And there's all kinds of propaganda and things made to marginalize and make black people less. And so that has many foundations that linger and echo in our society today. But again, police forces are often very much used today to take best care of the wealthy. And so there's lots of examples of that, because I bet if you make pull a smidge, out of their driveway into the grass, if in a rich neighborhood, you might get a call, and the calls from certain neighborhoods probably matter. The complaints and concerns probably matter a little bit more. And, we do what we're told at our jobs, at your jobs. And so it reminds me, the bad guys that recruit kids into gangs, they see their vulnerabilities. They see that they're wayward and needing some love and are willing to do if somebody will just hook them up. And so, but racism is truly, I think it's regressing in our society, and it's played upon by the fact that we're more hypervigilant with one another. We see certain sides kind of regressing to their collective corners to look at each other with more fear and suspicion and anger and aggression. We see that more and more. So there's a lot of contributors to this. But again, just like the vulnerable children that were preyed upon to be in gangs, a lot of people are angry and struggling in their own communities, and the internet sources and the hate spewers of the world prey upon anger and unmet need and depression, and get in their ear and say, you're angry and you're hurting, look at your life, and get them thinking that somebody else is their problem. I know a lot of people unemployed or don't have the family or life or job or career or money or health that they want, and it's always somebody else's fault. And so anyway, but when we are struggling, and when there is poor educational outcomes in a community, and when there's a lot of these different struggles, it's easy to create new racists. And I think that that's happening in our world. We're being taught that the other is the enemy, when we're supposed to look at each other as brothers and neighbors and friends. There's the old adage that we're only strong as the weakest link in the chain, but I think, we are a human chain, and there's increasingly many weak links as a result of the division. And there's certain people that are still profiting. There's certain people that are still profiting. The families who own slaves typically are still families that are doing really, really well. And the families who were slaves are families that are still struggling oftentimes. Many have climbed into some success or functionality, but generational trauma is real. And so anyway, we don't have to say that, hey, we're not racists, but we are perhaps contributing to the problem. Once again, if we're not willing to acknowledge the impacts that racism has had, the role that it's played in the early foundations of our nation, we can't just put it in the rear view and say, all right, we didn't do it. So, one of the things that I recognize too, as a white, straight, Caucasian, male, is there are certain dangers that don't exist as much for me as they do. I'm not as likely to have certain violence perpetrated on me. I'm not as likely to be, subjected and targeted for sexual assault. And I'm glad for that. I'm thankful for that. But, I was in a group of co-ed trained people once, and they were talking about what what women do to guard against being sexually assaulted. And they had all these things, weapons and groups they got together, and all these different strategies. And the men in the group had no answers. You, sir, what do you do? Nothing. I never thought about it. Well, think about not ever having to think about it. The risk of being assaulted in that way. So a lot of us have never had to experience racism, and therefore, not my reality. What are they bitching about? What are these women, what are they, talking about? But a lot of us really need to be willing to consider the experience that is not our own in order to help our nation turn a corner. And as social workers, as therapists, and as police officers, we're leaders in the world. We have to lead. We have to be a part of the change that we seek. Well, that's one of the things. I guess I will just touch on this, and you can show this slide briefly. And I've touched on some of these bullets already. But if we want to really, eradicate, negative impacts from our history or past, we need to watch for things like, now, there are deficits and flaws in any human and in any group of humans. But if we assign, negative attribute to that because, of the race, that's one way to kind of notice. But also, if we're more accepting of that same flaw or mistake within our own group, that's a big red flag. If you know people that do the same thing that you would judge in another, then again, there might be a red flag. And so one of the things, there are laws in the books that say, slavery is gone, and a lot of prejudice and racist practices that are harmful or have been abolished or whatever. But child abuse has been abolished too. And so is domestic violence, and drugs are illegal too. And, all kinds of things. In Texas, they're going to, rape's illegal. They're going to have no rape, no more. So they need to do that with murder too. I don't know why they didn't target that. But anyway, so these things are illegal, but they still happen a lot. So there's still a problem. And so racism is illegal, but it still happens a lot. And so that's the point that I wanted to make by that. The only thing that I'll say here about exploring our blind spots, and it's in keeping with the previous slides, is we don't really know what we don't know. We might catch ourselves in some of our errored thinking sometimes, but we all make mistakes, and we all have sometimes learned some dysfunctional thinking. America is a nation where race is a big issue. And so it does have some impact on us. And so, but we don't know what we don't know. And so that's why it's so important for us to be mindful, to seek our blind spots. So, I think it is important to recognize, well, for me, right and wrong is conceptual. It's a concept. I think most of us have bought into this concept, and I ascribe to it. There are universal rights and wrongs. But there is increasingly less consensus about what it means to be right and wrong. In the universe, when there's rocks spinning and flying around through space, and, universe is, exploding and stars dying, and there's no right or wrong, it's just what is. And so this is a human construct. We came up with this whole idea of right or wrong. So So whatever our notion of what right or wrong is, I think we have to, isn't it easy to notice the mistakes of others, the flaws of others, the things that we don't like about others? You know, it's not as easy to notice or want to acknowledge the flaws within ourselves or within our own group. And that's a human tendency. Nobody likes to think about what we need to do better and what we did bad. And, nobody wants to do that, but we need it for growth. We certainly need it for growth. So we've got to be mindful to be mindful. Being mindful means that we're thinking about what we're doing instead of just operating in autopilot and just reacting to the world as we will. We've got to be mindful to be mindful, and we've got to choose our responses. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence a little bit later on, because a lot of people just react to stuff. They may recognize their feelings later after they felt them and reacted with them, but I think it's important for us to slow that process down from reacting to deciding. And so, like I said, we got to be mindful to be mindful. And culture, let's think a little bit about culture. Culture is, when you look it up and, it has a definition, it's about the traditions, the practices, the values that we pass from generation to generation. It's what we teach it's what we do and what we teach the next to do. So, one thing I think that there are some big differences sometimes between what we say and between what we do. And so, and of course, in our Constitution, in our laws, in our policies, in our procedures, and the things that govern mental health and medicine and law enforcement and education, in these practices and others, we've got the right thing down usually on paper. But it's not just what we say, again, it is what we do. And so a lot of culture is what we show in our demonstrations, in our processes, in our practices. I remember, I tell these stories a lot. I don't remember what I have told people, but I was cleaning something up on the unit. There was nothing else to do. They were sitting down watching TV or in class or something, but there were some things that needed to be wiped down. And in orientation, they said, if there's nothing else to do, help clean the unit up. It's your job. I said, okay. That's my job. I better do it. And a 30-year veteran told me, what are you doing, man? You don't have to do that. I said, well, I was in training 2 weeks ago, and it said, I was very green, it said that we were supposed to do this. He said, well, fine if you want to. But this is how it really goes on the unit, man. That's what they have to say that to you. Culture. It was about, what we said was being told directly to me that we could do something different. And it was harmless in that instance, but in some instances it's not so harmless. I worked at a children's hospital where we were supposed to check kids to make sure they're alive every 15 minutes. Of course, they're in our care in this inpatient facility that I worked at the time. It was inpatient and acute care, like Robert mentioned. They were there because they were in danger of hurting themselves and somebody else. And a staff member went to go and check them during their sleep time. And we're supposed to put a little light on them and make sure that they're asleep safely in their bed, chest rising and falling with normal sleep. And a new staff member goes to check on a kid. You don't have to do that, man. We just check the boxes. They're sleepy. They're quiet. Culture. And that resulted in a child successfully ending their life in our facility, in our care, where we were billing insurance for professional medical and mental health treatment. And so culture. And so the outsider doesn't know what's being practiced in the unspoken, in the insider's moments. But sometimes when our culture is not trauma informed, when we're not really about what we're about in our policy and procedure, when we're not really remembering why we do what we do and how we do it and why those rules are in place as they are, then people die. And a child successfully ended their life where we were supposed to be keeping them safe from their mental illness. And so we have to be mindful about how we construct culture, because we have to care about what we're teaching to the next. You know, it's okay to decide to be a leader in whatever position in the field that you're in, to stand up and say, you know what, I have my contribution, my something to contribute to this culture, and I'm going to be conscious of that. And nobody has to be perfect, but we got to be trying to do right by ourselves, by our communities, and certainly by injured kids who need us to help them not grow up and keep being injured and suffering. So I think I covered that one. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time there, but I think it's important as we break down how we came to be, who we are, and how we are. Most officers are men, but for women officers as well, we have to you guys are probably learning a lot about what it means to be tough and to be an officer. And you've certainly had to overcome a lot of the stereotypes because it's typically male-dominated field. But where do we get our man stuff? You know, does you have to have a big hat or a big gun? Is it the car? Is it the sex? Is it we watch sports? You know, you got to drink beer and burp a lot. I mean, what do we? You know, Tim the Tool Man. What does it mean to be a man? And so I think that, you know, there's lots of different ways to live a life. You know, 2 + 2 makes 4, and I can prove that however you stack it. But what it means to be a man, you know, is, I think, decided by the individual. You know, little boys are not supposed to play with dolls or wear pink. Now, in some ancient cultures, pink was the color of valor and bravery. You know, so the soldiers and the badasses were the ones that were wearing pink. So just because they said so, you know, it's all conceptual. Just because somebody said so once upon a time, and then everybody else followed it and agreed, and then it became a thing, you know. So I think the point here that I hope to make is that somewhere along the line, masculinity was found to somehow be incompatible with intelligence. It's like, if you use your brain and acknowledge real things, if it causes us to appear in any way vulnerable, then, you know, we deny that. We got to be tough rather than strong. But I'm here to believe, because I consider myself to be kind of a man's man, a tough guy or whatever for the, you know, but I also acknowledge the need, the necessity to use what is known. You know, to acknowledge, you know, there's that movie Zoolander. It's a ridiculous movie. He says, I think I got the black lung, Pop, from one day in the coal mines. These were guys, they were very tough and gruff, and, you know, they'd been doing it for years, and they, you know, they knew about the work and everything, and the whatever. You know, you've only been doing it one day. But I don't think that being a man requires the black lung, you know. I don't think that it requires us to not wear helmets and safety precautions. I'm a man, you know. I mean, we can go ahead and acknowledge and utilize the knowledge and the data that does exist. You know, there was this guy that I worked with. He had been incarcerated, and he didn't believe in this therapy stuff. And said, but I got to have somebody sign my paper. It says I come to you once a month. Will you sign my paper so I can stay out and work, take care of my family? I said, well, I thought to myself, I was like, hey man, this is a free hour. I could just sign his paper and then have my time to myself. But that's not ethical practice. That's not really, you know, billing for a service and then actually providing the service. So I knew that I was called to this work to try to light a little fire in him, to try to provide some good knowledge and encouragement to him. I said, well, you know what? I don't have to do therapy, man. But I've learned some really cool stuff about this electrical impulses that happens in your brain. And, you know, these neurochemicals get stronger and stronger. And if you don't know how you feel and why you feel that way, then feelings are going to come out of you in all these different ways. And he said, oh, yeah, I recognize some of that. And I told him, hey, man, that's a cool tattoo. You know, and then I showed him one of my tattoos. And then we was talking tattoos. And, hey, you're pretty cool, man. And I'll come in here and talk to you. And we didn't get to call it therapy. But he participated and appeared to benefit. So even us tough guys, I've worked with soldiers, with officers, and anyone can benefit from therapy, from emotional intelligence, from knowing about our emotions and how they affect us. You know, that's one thing. We got to be tough. the male body is built differently than the female body. We have denser bone structure and muscles. We're physically more capable for certain tasks, certainly violence and aggression. And so we have that capacity for a reason. And so we do got to be tough, and we got to throw down sometimes. But we also have to recognize that strength is also about applying compassion, it's about applying intelligence, and it's about throwing down only as needed, and not having that violence be our go-to, because we're taught to only be tough. And we have to challenge some of that, because boys are taught, from a young age, little boys don't cry, and little girls don't. It's not acceptable for little girls to get in fights at school, but what do we say? If your little boys get into a fight, So from an early age, we're kind of programming for some violence. And so we've got to recognize that as a violent species, we do need to pick and choose intelligently and logically when it's appropriate and apply it as needed and not as a go-to. Okay, so now we're going to get into talking a little bit more about handle with care. And so part of how we're hoping for mental health and police work to join forces is for us to kind of help recognize the injuries and the injured behaviors in kids, so that kids are not simply judged, punished, and criticized and shamed and chased away from the supports and the resources that are needed. And so we're going to show a little video about handle with care, and then he can comment on that, and he's going to share some more information with you about handle with care. Super easy process that helps us help kids.
Hi everybody, it's Chief Acevedo. The video you're about to watch is really important to me, and I know it's important to you. It's all about safeguarding children. What we do for and with children when we arrest their parents will have a huge impact potentially on their lives and the outcome of their adulthood. So as you watch, please think about how you would want your child or someone you loved, a child you love, treated under a circumstance that can be so traumatic. It's really important that we, as law enforcement professionals, guardians and peacekeepers, peacemakers, do everything we can to minimize the lifelong impact the arrest of a parent can have on a child. So let's help these children become survivors. Let's help them reach their destination. Let's help them reach their future by showing some compassion, some care, and more importantly, by showing them some dignity and even their parents' dignity.
When parents are arrested, children can pay the price. The shock, fear, confusion, anxiety, and anger generated during an arrest may negatively affect their emotional, mental, social, and physical health. Treating the children of arrested parents with compassion and thoughtfulness is not only the right thing to do, it is a hallmark of good policing. Considering their needs before, during, and after an arrest is critical in minimizing trauma and ensuring their safety.
One day I was at home, and all of a sudden there was a knock on the door, and two policemen just rushed in and just arrested my mom. And they told us that they're just gonna bring her right back. So I wasn't really mad. But then when the day passed and then 2 days passed, I was wondering, like, where's my mom? Then I seen the news, and I seen her picture and the other person she was arrested with, and the news just said first-degree murder. So I just broke down.
When we have these cases where a parent is arrested, I need to take an extra couple of minutes and go talk to that young child and make sure that they're okay and that they understand that they've done nothing wrong here and that we can help them out and we can maybe get some services to follow up with them. So the training piece is really huge because young officers may not have that context. This might be the first time they're engaged in a situation like this, and they're not necessarily going to know off the top of their head of how to react to that. So we really need to provide that training of, hey, here's some things you can do to help alleviate the trauma that child's going through.
Arrests that involve parents and children bring unique challenges that require officers to use a well-defined set of best practices. However, it is essential for the officer to ask individuals directly if children are present. Minimizing the trauma experienced by children during a parent's arrest has the potential to lessen the risk of negative outcomes in adulthood and increase confidence in the police and the fairness of the system during childhood and adolescence. Children of all ages are vulnerable to potential trauma following the arrest of a parent. Children are not always present during a parent's arrest and could come home from school to an empty house. Officers need to identify this situation when arresting a parent and make arrangements to place these children with a responsible adult. If possible, consult with the parent on who should pick their children up and who will provide temporary care. Processing is another point in the arrest where officers can inquire as to whether an arrestee has a child who would be affected. Allowing the arrestee to use his or her cell phone increases the likelihood of the parent speaking directly with the child. The presence of children during arrests made during traffic stops is common. Officers should acknowledge children on scene and interact directly with them in ways appropriate to the children's age and developmental level.
Some of the biggest benefits to this is that that child feels okay, that they don't internalize a negative situation, that they don't respond in negative ways, they don't respond by being depressed, they don't respond by, acting out, but that they know that there's some hope in the melee, and that there are people who are out there to help safeguard them.
The Safeguarding Children of Arrested Parents Model Policy. It is a template agencies can use to develop or customize their own internal policies and procedures. The model policy also provides rationale behind its approaches and outlines best practices.
Our number one job is protecting the vulnerable. That's our number one job, plain and simple. We can put it in any terms we want, but ultimately, if you ask me, our number one job is protecting the vulnerable. And who else is more vulnerable than the children in our society?
All right, thank you, Jeremy. We've talked a lot about history, culture, and introspective kind of things about the work that we do and the processes that we go through. But one of the things we wanted to provide for you today is an opportunity, an option for police, when they encounter children, to make a difference in that child's life. I can tell you just from working with the police, as I mentioned earlier, we worked together frequently on emergency orders of detention and things like that, mental health issues that go on in the community. And whenever there were children involved, the police they knew they were there, but they felt kind of helpless in order to be able to do something to help that child. So in the state of West Virginia, the Center for Children's Justice in that state came up with this very simple plan, and they called it Handle with Care. It has three main elements, three main partners. Each one of them brings an element of the project to the table. Those three are law enforcement, schools, and the local behavioral health provider. Several of the schools that I've worked with have implemented Handle with Care, and so what I've learned from that is that each community has to develop their own processes for implementation, but those three elements are always involved. So in Tahlequah, for instance, the reporting mechanism is fairly robust and flexible, so that they could add a box to their reporting document that just checked Handle with Care. When the police encounter a child or a teen at an event, no matter what that event is, they don't have to make any decision about trauma, whether it's traumatized or not. They mark that box, Handle with Care. That information then goes to a central dispatch and is communicated to the school the next day. Before the school bell rings the next day, the classroom teacher and the administrator and hopefully their behavioral health coach or behavioral health aide would be aware that something has happened, and so they're going to be able to be more sensitive to the needs of that child. So all the police has to do in those cases where they make a call is say the child's name, what school they attend if they know, and Handle with Care, and that's it. The school does not know what happened. They don't need to know. The police have not had to make a decision in the field as to whether that child experienced trauma or not. They don't need to know. What they're doing is announcing to the school that something has happened. And so the next day, if the child doesn't have their homework or falls asleep in class, any of those things that historically would have been responded to with some kind of punitive action, the teacher can respond differently. That's one of the things as we look at the culture of schools. That's part of the reason we've talked so much today about culture and making changes in those cultures. Handle with Care is a step toward cultural change within the school system, the educational system. We don't have kids sit out in the hall anymore. Like when I was a kid, we'd get sent to the principal's office, or if we didn't have our homework, or if we were talking too much or fell asleep, we'd be sent out into the hall. The Evolution Foundation is one of our supports for that, for Handle with Care, has throughout northeastern Oklahoma, where we had received some grant money, we were able to provide resources to the local schools to be able to develop what we initially called calming rooms, but we've kind of renamed those to reset rooms. But they're a place where kids can go and meet with their behavioral health coach or their therapist if they need to, or just get away for a few minutes to regather themselves. And one of the things we've talked about before is the resilience of children. They can go in there and regather and get in touch with their resilient self, and then go back to the classroom. The intention is to have a successful school, successful child, and provide police with an opportunity to believe and know that they have done something in a positive way to impact the life of that child. That's an important element of Handle with Care, is to be able to provide you, the law enforcement officer, with that tool. Because as we talked about earlier, as Jeremy has mentioned, you are the tool that when you look in your toolbox, what do you see there? It's a mirror. You're the person that engages with the community. You're the person who the public sees. And this is another tool for police officers to have when they look in there and have historically not had anything to be able to do to help a child. This makes a difference. And according to Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a fairly famous neuropsychologist or psychiatrist who studies neurology and has done extensive research into trauma, I think a couple of years ago he did a training in Oklahoma and was in the Cox Center in Oklahoma City, and I think there were 7,000 to 8,000 school teachers that were present. But I was present as well, and one of the things that he said that struck me was that a positive engagement with another person, with an adult particularly, that lasts 8 seconds or less can have a positive impact on a child's day. And if you can make a difference like that in 8 seconds, then that really presents an opportunity. And it helps develop that kind of relationship with an adult, a person of authority that shows that they care. And so it makes a difference in how that child may perceive police encounters in the future as they grow into adulthood. To make that shift in culture that enables both police, the schools, and the student and their family ultimately to be successful. So that's what we're after with Handle with Care. As Jeremy said, it's a fairly simple project. It's a fairly simple process, and so we're able to engage it fairly rapidly. So far, let's see, there's a map. You can look on the slide that shows the map of communities in Oklahoma that are either currently considering implementation or have implemented. In the 3 school districts that I've worked with directly, Tahlequah, Delaware County is Grove, and Miami Public Schools up in Ottawa County. Those 3 have taken different paths to the same outcome. Tahlequah is the one that has the check box. Jeremy and I had have done training with the police department there. They do the check box. In Grove, we've done training with the police department there. They have a call system, and they're able to call and just say the handle with care comment, and gets that ball rolling. Up in Miami, in Miami, which is Ottawa County, they have a multiple agency dispatch system, so it's unified across fire, police, EMS. They all get the same dispatch. And they've all actually expanded that to some extent to be able to include all of those first responders. So when 911 is called, it doesn't have to just be a police officer. It could be EMS or fire, and if there's a child there, they can all call, or they can all make that call to handle with care. So it's a good program that gives them, all of them, to that tool. And in fact, schools have started using that internally, where if they know something, perhaps there wasn't a police encounter or any of the 911 encounters, but a parent may have called and said their child had an event the night before. The schools are now able to use Handle with Care. And in fact, some schools classroom teachers have provided their contact information to parents so that they could do a Handle with Care notification themselves. So it's fairly easy. It's a robust system that can make a difference in people's lives, and we're pleased to be able to support it and move toward implementation. One of the things that you'll see on the slide too is there's Handle with Care Oklahoma, the state organization, is working with the state law enforcement to implement RAVE across the state in all 500 and however many school districts we have. But it's a single call notification of an emergency at a school. So it could be a medical emergency, a weather emergency, or I think they started it for active shooter emergencies, but one call notifies all the law enforcement as well as notifies the school staff, from bus drivers. All of them are able to be notified. So that's another tool for law enforcement to look at engaging. If you haven't heard of it, the contact information is included in the slides.
So now I want to talk with you guys and gals about something called emotional intelligence. So I know that we don't get to hang out and interact in person today, wherever you are doing what you do, but I'm curious to kind of know what people think about emotional intelligence, what that term means, what the concept is. So, think about that for a second. I'll give you just a moment to think, rhetorically to yourself, or perhaps if you're watching this with other officers, you can pause the video and have a little bit of discussion, if you like. Just a thought, just an idea. So, but emotional intelligence, it's a term that us therapist types use, a lot, and it makes us feel fancy and emotionally intelligent, sophisticated, whatever. But really, it's not a terribly complicated term. We know what emotions are, and we know what intelligence is. So think about putting those together. We want to become more intelligent about our emotions. We want to be smarter about our feelings. And so I didn't originate the concept of emotional intelligence, but I've been studying it and thinking about it pretty exhaustively for a number of years now. And so for me, I don't want to just know what to do. And, I want to know why. So I need to understand some of my brain and my basic parts to understand what it is that's happening when I experience my emotions. So again, like I mentioned before, with trauma and helping us define that and understand that what it is, we have to understand that emotions are not good or bad, right or wrong. They are these neurochemical and electrical impulse processes that happen in our brain, and evidence does show if we don't know how we feel and why we feel that way, then we're less likely to let our, we're more likely to let our feelings out in ways that we don't want them to come out, in ways that are not helpful or productive. And so we have lots of different components in our brain, but for this discussion, I'd like us to think about two of them. We have our cortex, technically it's our prefrontal cerebral cortex, but the cortex is our smart brain, and it does most of our most complex reasoning and thinking and remembering and planning and problem solving. So a very important part of our brain. And then we have the limbic system. That's our emotional brain. It doesn't think or reason or do a lot of complex things. What it does is it just feels and wants. It's very instinctive and primal. And so we need both parts for different reasons, but we know that the limbic system isn't helpful for solving problems. And so one of the things that we want to do when we think about how it is that we're feeling, what we're doing is we're using our cortex to look at our limbic system and to see what it's doing. And we gain some awareness, because a lot of people, again, don't recognize their feelings until they've already been felt, until they've already been reacted upon. And so we want to stop and slow that process down of reacting and then make a decision, because a lot of feelings don't feel very good. There's, some feelings are very unpleasant, but we need those capacities. We're not born with capacities that aren't necessary for some of our functions, for some needs. And so, again, things like anger and sadness, these are what we call, what I would call negative motivators. These are our brains saying, we don't like this. And if we can, we need to do something about it to change it and make it better. And if not, it also it teaches us some level of acceptance and other things. So again, fear and stress responses are very, very important and necessary. If human beings are not scared of things that they're supposed to be scared of, they get eaten quick, they get run over, they fall off of things. We need healthy fear and that response. In fact, it speeds up our brain. And some of you guys may recognize this or whatever, but when you're stressed out or scared, then what's happening is your brain is reacting quickly and instinctively to the threat or the perceived threat. And so, again, if we're about to get in an auto accident or we're being attacked, sometimes it appears that the action slows down, and that's a helpful process. Our brain is trying to help us have the time to react more quickly to save ourselves. So that's a good thing. Now, if we do have to experience it too often, then it's, again, our brain is use dependent. Our nervous system is use dependent. So how much we use it and how it's stimulated is how much it grows. And how active it becomes. And so, again, but we need this function in our brain. It's necessary, because if we are under a threat, if we're running away from danger or fighting off an attack of some sort, then we don't need to be thinking about what we're going to watch on Netflix later, or wondering what's for dinner. If we're running away from a predator, we're trying not to be dinner. And so again, in those instances, we don't think in words. We think in actions and reactions, basically, and we don't think much at all. So it becomes very instinctive. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so important to train our skills, because we just go with whatever, when we are in a heated or intense situation. But our stress response, I compare it to kind of like that of a slow motion photography lens. In slow motion photography, some of you camera bugs might not realize the image in slow motion is obviously slowed down, but that's because the mechanisms of the camera, there are more frames per second happening. The camera's moving faster to show you a slower image. I compare it to like when we're running late to be somewhere, or when we're running close on time and it seems like everybody is driving slower and is taking forever to do things when they're in front of us. It may be that we've caught a strain of bad luck with our traffic, but more likely it is that your brain is moving faster than the regular world is. And And so it makes it feel like everything's taken forever for the lights to change and different things. But we want to be emotionally intelligent. We want to recognize that we have these emotional capacities, and so we're supposed to let these help guide us, help us navigate, decision make, and problem solve. And so there is something I would say called the cognitive tug of war. It's what I call it anyway, because very oftentimes we know what we ought to do, but then we feel something or want something differently. And so that's really important. So, but emotions are very reactive. And so to be emotionally intelligent, we have to remember to use our feelings for what they're for. And also we have to recognize that, we all learned what feelings look like and sound like in that pre-logic time. Hopefully you only learn from very healthy and wholesome examples of what these processes are supposed to look and sound like. Maybe you only learn from, really, really healthy, positive people and Mr. Rogers on television. And, that's great. But a lot of times we also have to recognize that sometimes we do absorb some data that's not always helpful for ourselves. So we have to recognize our capacities and use our feelings for what they're for. So I talk a lot about emotional intelligence, and I could say, probably a ton more about that. But one of the things I will say, it's about the difference between human beings and other creatures. I have these dogs that I have to kind of herd into the bedroom when I'm recording these things like we had to do today. But my dogs, they remind me about emotional intelligence. When a dog gets excited, there's a certain part of their body that shows their emotion. And so, and I have big dogs, so when someone knocks on the door, they get excited. Sometimes tails start wagging, and then all of a sudden, if I've got a soda on the counter or on the table, near the chair in there, then it's going down. It used to frustrate me so much, but I've learned to try not to keep drinks in tail wagging range. Or whatever, because now one of the things, in thinking about it, when I ponder on emotional intelligence a lot, the dog's tail is an appendage, comes off their rear end, which is, connected to their spine, which is connected to their brain stem, which is connected to their limbic system. And so now a dog has a very unconscious response. The dog doesn't say, you know what, I'm getting pretty excited. I think it's time to wag my tail. And the dog also doesn't recognize that, Daddy doesn't like the way I wag my tail in response to that stimulus of door knocking. Dogs have pretty small brains, so they don't have the ability to think much about their actions and reactions. They just do what they do. And of course, that tail wagging is a pretty unconscious thing. Now, human beings, we have much bigger brains. We have approximately 16 billion neurons in our cerebral cortex. As far as we know, that's the biggest brain in the universe. And so we are the only creature that we can observe or detect that thinks about thinking. We think about our own thoughts. We think about our own actions. We plan and remember and decide, and we can reflect on, of course, the meaning of life and all these different things, but we can also recognize our own tendencies and triggers. We can recognize what things make us do what we do when we do what we do. And we are not doomed to simply succumb to the same old triggers and reactions. Because if you're reacting well to certain triggers, great. But you be willing to challenge those areas where you perhaps don't, react so well. Because human beings, we do have the ability to change our own brain. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more here later. But we're not simply stuck with the brains that we have. Now, if we learned some unhealthy ways of expressing and dealing with emotions earlier in life, that's not our fault. We didn't give ourselves or choose that data, But the great thing is we get to keep giving our brain new data. We get to put new data into our memory bank, and then we get to actively choose to use that new data. So we're not simply doomed to just, do what we always did. Because like they say, if you do what you always did, you get what you always got. And so sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but that's pretty cool. Anyone ever told you that you just need to think more positively? How did that make you feel? You know, did you feel real validated and supported, like, you know, or did you feel dismissed? Did you feel like somebody wasn't really comfortable with your outlook at the time, or your emotional response to a situation in life that they may or may not have understood? You know, well, I agree with the need to think more positively, and I also recognize that there are many challenges to thinking more positively. So, and again, somebody tells me when I'm having a rough time and I'm not feeling the greatest about life to think more positively. Sometimes, you know, you want to chunk a rock at them or something. You know, think more positively. Well, maybe you don't understand where I'm coming from right now. I'm not in a positive place. And so, now again, and I'm not, I like to operate from the science of, you know, the human brain and body and physiology and neurology and psychology. All those ologies make you sound smart. But really, I want to know why to think more positively and how to think more positively and what this does for me. Now, one of the things I want to acknowledge too is human beings, I mentioned before, we're a very adaptable species. We require that developmental flexibility to not be broken by the times and circumstances that we operate within. And so we need to be able to adapt. But what happens when you operate in a world of shit? What happens when you're, you know, overwhelmed by discouragement and frustration and hurt? You know, you're going to be interacting so commonly and often with injured people doing injured things, and emotional, you know, contagion is going to be something that you have to contend with on a regular basis. And so now the problem is with being in a world that's stressful and frustrating and discouraging, when we adapt to that, is we start to do it to ourselves. And sometimes we don't recognize it. We still see it as a you know, somebody else's problem, or how messed up the world is. And the world's jacked up. It's true. And you know, and you guys get to get a first-hand look at that on a regular basis. But again, what I'm hoping to help you guys recognize is when we think negative or pessimistic, or what we would term, us therapist types call, unhelpful thoughts, then what we're doing is we're operating from the limbic system. People, there's a neurologist, Dr. Amen, and somewhere out east, I forget, he maps the brain and shows what's lighting up and when in different neurological processes. And so he shows that when we're thinking negatively or pessimistically, our limbic system is most active. And that's, again, that's not the rational or reasoning part of our brain. That's the I want, I feel, I need, you know, kind of portion of our brain. It's not good for problem solving. Now, it shows that when we're thinking optimistic thoughts, you know, when we're thinking positive thoughts, or when we're challenging unhelpful thoughts, when we're looking for a way for it to still be okay. When we can challenge thoughts that do not benefit us, we are choosing to access our cerebral cortex more readily. And that's what we need to make some sense of this world. Again, sense, common sense and all those things, those are human constructs. We come up with those ideas. You know, the universe and the world, a lot of things just probably are never going to make sense. But it is proven that we can get more of our best access to our brain when we can challenge thoughts that do not benefit us. And so let's think about that. Sometimes I think about, what kind of day it's going to be. What kind of day is this going to be today? If we get up and tell ourselves it's going to be a crappy day, I can just feel it. That's an unhelpful thought. Because if I think it's going to be a crappy day today, of course, that's the thought. And then the feeling comes next, because there's something called the cognitive triangle. Thoughts, feelings, actions are connected in the brain. So I think it's going to be a crappy day. And then I feel pretty discouraged and frustrated about, hopeless even about my day. And then that's going to affect how I engage my day, the actions, the interactions, the things I do and say, And so you guys are, bombarded with negativity. So you've got quite a task, you know, at not buying into all of that negativity and then therefore basically having someone to blame, you know. Because we've all got somebody that we can point the finger at and to say, you know, it would be better if only this. And granted, we all, you know, need better systems and better services and supports and resources. I support and believe in every bit of that. But each and every one of us have to challenge thoughts that don't benefit us in order to be emotionally intelligent, in order to have access to the best parts of our brain when we need them most. So, you know, when we talk about challenging these neurological barriers, you know, that's real science. That's not just blowing a rainbow up your nose and telling you to think better about things, because again, that's, you know, that you guys have so much negativity to contend with, and so much hurt and injury, and your own and others and your own and whatever. But just an example though, when they were scanning those brains, they would talk with people, and when the limbic system was active, they could kind of explore those thoughts that. Those assumptions, those beliefs that things were not going to work out. And very oftentimes by dissecting those and looking at what is still possible, people began discussions with lots of limbic system activity lighting up in the brain scan, talking about how it wasn't going to work. And with a little bit of cognitive challenging, that part of their brain had gotten dark. And they, you know, finished that conversation with a plan for how it could work. And their cerebral cortex was alight with activity. And then, of course, that affected their mood, too. Because if you believe, hey, there's still a way, then you feel a little bit, you know, better about the situation, and you're willing to undertake it and take it on. So anyway, so that's real science. I just want you know, to reiterate that, because it's so important that we learn to challenge thoughts that don't benefit us. So now talking about self-care. You know, I want to acknowledge the challenges that we do have to self-care. Many of us work 40, 50 or more hours a week, you know, in high stress and very demanding jobs. And so, you know, and a lot of times, you know, our work, our employers, our supervisors, they acknowledge this need that we have for some time to do something other than work and sleep. But very oftentimes we are given heavy caseloads, you know, heavy shifts, you know, and said, be sure to take care of yourself. But, you know, here's 100 patients, see them all, but take care of yourself too. Okay. So you guys are familiar with that kind of workload. And again, this is where we may have to challenge thoughts that don't benefit us, because we can find time to take care of ourselves, because if we don't, we're going to have less time. And so I call these forgotten fundamentals, because, well, everybody needs to do the basics to be okay. And these are things that they taught us in grade school that we're like, yeah, we know, but we don't do it, you know, and we can talk about what's available as far as food and access and different things, but that's a different discussion. We work with a high stress population, and so that means probably some extra self-care is going to be needed. And we are going to need to meet the basics. And so, you know, remembering things like eating enough healthy food. Remember that one of the most common unhealthy injured behaviors in Oklahoma, it's not the shootouts and the intravenous drug users. It's the way that we eat, and that we slowly poison ourselves with unhealthy foods. And so diet, I'm not telling people to go on a diet, but making sure that we check in with our nutrition and getting some of those basic, you know, fundamental nutrients and proper hydration is going to be key. I'm no qualified nutritionist, but I certainly recognize that my brain and body do better when I put better fuel in my machine. And so, but it is really key to think about that, because there are so many people that put lots of crap in their body and then wonder why they feel poorly. And so sleep is also really key. And again, the traumatized and stressed individual is going to be challenged in that. They're going to have more resting heartbeats per minute, and they're going to have more rapid and shallow breathing, just by adaptation to stress and that fight, flight, and freeze response that's so continuously active in their system. So, we can't just erase that physiological impact, but we can take some steps to manage sleep and to allot a certain amount of time. We're not supermen and women. We do still need that. Because sleep is when our body's restorative processes are most active. So it literally will truly shorten your life if you don't get enough sleep. The average person needs at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And if at 8 hours, some people say I get 6. Well, that only is, I'm missing 25% of my sleep. But the most deep and healthy levels and necessary levels of sleep are right there at the end. When our alarm clock goes off and we want to hit it and sleep a little bit longer, that's when we're really getting that best restorative sleep. And so if we miss 25% of our 8 hours, then we may be missing up to 60% or more of the best sleep that we need. And so we age more rapidly, we get sick more often, viruses and bacteria and germs and more significant illness does interact with our system all the time. Cancer cells exist in the human body. And so our healthy immune systems keep those at bay. Or if we don't, again, allow our systems to restore and reprocess, then the aches and pains of daily life, the wear and tear on our body, and then the things that invade our body are going to take over more quickly. And exercise, a lot of police departments I'm seeing have some built-in time or space for exercise, and I applaud that. That needs to be happening more. I say that, it needs to be more like military. I know my brother, he got to work out on the job, and I was like, wow. There was a lot of parts of his job I didn't envy, but I would love to get to work out on the job because I build that into my time one way or another, but it's so important. And one of the things that I will just say, and of course, as you guys, officers know, y'all have to stay physically fit to stay qualified and to stay active in your jobs anyway. But one of the things that I will challenge you guys on a little bit is police officers have more trauma and or chronic stress than the average human being. And so what that means is your body, your stress response is more active more often. You're producing more cortisol, more adrenaline is being produced actively in your body. So that is going to create more generalized anxiety and more specific anxieties. And it's going to make you feel more jittery and nervous and at times perhaps nauseous, and it's going to do a lot of different things to you physiologically and emotionally. And of course, when our nerves are like this and on heightened alert for a long time, that is physically exhausting. So rates of depression go up. And so, but when we burn off that energy, we do some, healthy things for us. We boost serotonin and dopamine and some of these endorphins and neurotransmitters that help us relax, that help us feel good, that help us feel positive. And certainly we do improve our neurological processes when we take in lots of deep breaths with heart pounding and getting those reps going, because we're sending oxygen-rich blood through all the different components of our brain and body. And that's what we need to heal. That's what we need to think. That's what we need to live. And so, but I will say, again, it's not fair, but it's true. People with more trauma have probably more of a need to exercise than the average person. And that just means we get to be more handsome and good looking and all that good stuff. I guess we can look for the silver lining. But again, every person has at least what I would call 2 layers of energy. Food is fuel. We know that caloric intake does produce our, provide our body with the fuel that it needs to function. And we also know that's the human stress response, that fight, flight, or freeze. It does also create a little bit of adrenaline and endorphins and different things that are, preparing us for action or battle or flight or, whatever. And so, and in this day and age, the things that stress us out tend to be different than our ancestors that had to fight off saber-tooth or whatever predators were present in the day. Their life was very active, hunting, foraging, fighting, and running. And so the human stress response was preparing them to do that. Now, in our supposedly more civil society, Modern times, the things that typically the average human being stresses them out. It's work, it's money, it's family, it's health, it's politics, it's all kinds of different things that stress us out. And our human body's still doing this and preparing us to fight or run away or lock up and freeze. And so, it's not appropriate for us to slug somebody and run away. It's not appropriate in most human scenarios for us to be violent or aggressive or to flee. That'd be weird. People slugging their coworkers and then bailing, when they're stressed out at work, but our body requires some level of exertion. So I call it an energy equivalent. And so, but also think about people with active chronic stress injuries or post-traumatic stress. They have a third level of energy because, again, food is fuel. Hopefully they're doing some food. Stress from day-to-day life is going to, be active in their lives from just normal stuff. But then there's going to be a layer of stress that's post to a trauma. And so that means those of us that have been affected by these injuries have to move more. And so, that is absolutely necessary. And building in some recreation. Everybody gets to say what their life is about and why they're here. Nobody decided to be on planet Earth, but we get to decide what to be here. And so I think it's really important as we get older, as grown-ups, we don't have teenage years and being a teenager and getting to drive and getting to buy stuff and, go to rated R movies. We don't have those built-in, looking forward to milestones. So it's really important for us to, in our day or our week or our month, we have to build in things to look forward to recreate, to enjoy, life is pretty, it beats us down when we don't have things to look forward to. So, and that's kind of getting into relaxation, joy, and our purpose. But anyway, we'll talk more about that another time. I teach mental health professionals primarily, but I also work with teachers and with law enforcement. And so I want to, acknowledge once again, you guys and gals operate in a quite different world than I do. And so talking about the common barriers and blockers may not be quite as applicable, but still relevant for your knowledge. And so we talk about things like no shouting and the barriers and blockers like critical and blaming statements. When you begin a statement with why or with you, you're very often, blaming that person or criticizing them. And critical or blaming statements are often very accurate, but they often trigger defensiveness in the listener. And so one of the things that, we have to be as mental health professionals, as law enforcement officers, and as people who treat and interact in our community, we have to be communicators. Now, our ability to communicate is going to be life or death. Now we know that there are weapons and mechanisms in place, for when communication is no longer an option. But I think it's important for us to understand too how the brain interacts and reacts to certain types of triggers and certain types of sound. And so, again, we say no shouting. Now, sometimes when you guys do your job, shouting will be necessary in some interactions, but not all. And so communication is what is so necessary, and communication is up to 85% nonverbal. So that means not what we say, just the words and the definitions of those words. So much of it does have to do with how we look and how we sound. And so how we look and how we sound means everything, because we're emotional beings, and so very oftentimes if somebody's got much emotion in their tone or much force in their tone, the human brain is reacting split seconds before there's any perception of those words. And so that's one of the reasons that when we don't, when we can avoid shouting and aggressive language and tones, that it's so beneficial for the interaction, because we want them to interact and respond appropriately with us. But if we trigger their defense mechanisms, then we diminish their ability to process information. So that's why it's so important that we're calm when we can be calm. when we can speak in a low and even tone, we allow their brain to hear. And again, a lot of people are scared of cops anyway. And that's very likely something that has nothing to do with you, but in this moment, everything to do with you. And so it's just going to be so important for you to present in the least threatening way possible so they can hear necessary commands or interactions or instructions or requests that you need to make of them. And so, one of the things that I've often, talked about in our trainings, if I was present with you guys, and I usually don't do this, I just kind of speak of it rhetorically, but I could make sure and inform my audience that, hey, I'm about to do a role play and I'm about to become loud and aggressive. I'll act like one of those unstable people that you have to interact with in the community. I'll start stomping and cussing. I might slam this chair down right here. And again, I never do that. But I also, would say if I do that in your presence, and you know that I'm a social worker and that I mean you no harm, if I hit a certain decibel level and a certain level of realism, even though your cerebral cortex knows that you're okay, your nervous system takes over at a certain point and says, we don't know if we're okay, so we become less able to process information and we become more reactive. And so I can make your heartbeat change by the sound of my voice and how loud it is, even though your brain knows you're okay. And so think about that. If we're triggering defense mechanisms unnecessarily, then we, as the authority, the leader, the professional, the person that's offering the intervention, we are diminishing their ability to receive our help. So, and one of the things I notice, you guys, it's a culture that I'm not a part of and I don't understand, but many officers have a certain demeanor, a certain affect. It's pretty, I don't know what the word is, tough, stoic, a little dry sometimes. Love you guys, but no offense. And so understanding, I get it. The world doesn't understand all the pain and suffering and bullshit that you have to interact with and worry about from day to day. But you also have to understand what the world looks like to the rest of us who are not, engaged in those interactions. And so we have to be tough when it's time to be tough, and we have to be soft and more caring. And we have to soften that tone and affect. And they call it resting bitch face or whatever, resting face with the ladies. They forget that they're like really frustrated or they're really focused on a task or whatever. Well, we get some resting whatever face too. We forget how we look and sound to people. And so being mindful about our presentation is really so important. Because think about it from the other person's perspective. You guys are big and tough, and you got badges and guns, and so think about what your face looks like and how you present. And so I'm gonna get there's some people that need to certainly be put in their place, but you might still be wearing that face to the next one who is certainly much less threatening or may need a lot of compassion. But like it says, we want to engage to help, not startle. We want to remember our mission is to protect and to serve. And again, when you have dealt with so much negativity, again, finish this sentence for me. Red, yellow, green, red, yellow, green, red, yellow, green. Red, yellow, what color's coming next. But sometimes, human dynamics surprise us. Sometimes when we assume that something is not what it is, or when we assume the worst in people because we've seen so much of it already, then we have the potential to be less helpful to those who we're dedicated to protect and to serve. And so we want to be very purposeful in our presentation. Again, it's just getting right down to the mission. It is remembering why we come to this work, because if we ever react badly, if people upset us and make us or cause us to react or whatever in a way that we find regretful, that doesn't make us feel good. That doesn't make us feel proud. And we've all probably, reacted in ways that we later on, when we were calm, we didn't feel so great about. And again, I won't tell you guys how to do your job. Sometimes you are supposed to startle them. Sometimes you are supposed to jump in their shit, and using that sparingly and as needed, and being able to kind of change your hats as necessary. So anyway, I tell this one story. I was, working in Seminole, and I was working with adults at the time. I'm typically working with a lot of kids now, but I was working with adults, and they called me from the front and said one of my patients was heading back. And I said, okay, I wasn't expecting that day. So we had to get him out of the lobby. He's got something, and he's talking crazy. And so I said, okay. So I met him in the hallway and got him back, and he was being menacing and threatening, and he was doing a lot of moving around. Now remember, I'm vision impaired, so he had something and I couldn't tell what it was. And so I asked him what it was, and he told me he had a 50 caliber weapon. And so now I have some limited vision, and as he pulled this appeared to be a small firearm out of his pants pocket, I could tell that it was no bear killer. It was no 50 caliber weapon. And so, but I stayed calm. My instinct first was aggression, tackle him, take him down, and then it would have certainly been the struggle for my life. And so, but I kept an even tone. And I remember I kind of asked him, I said, 50 cal, I've never seen one of those. Can I touch it? And I did my best blind face, and I just reached out. He said, sure. He was fed up with some paranoid delusions that he had, was perceiving, but he let me touch his gun, and I went ahead and took it in my hands and decided that it needed to be placed in the office next door. And so remaining calm and rehearsing this scenario, or these types of scenarios in my head over and over again, is something that was necessary for me and for him as well, because the police had been called and they were coming down the hall and they were ready to pull their guns, and we were able to say, no gun, no gun, no gun. And so he got to go to a treatment center instead of to a mortuary that day. And it could have gone the other way. We know we have to engage our force and our aggression and our violence and our weapons sometimes, but again, our brain and our heart are the most powerful human tools, and we're here to help people. I think we're here to help all people, not just people we like, not just people who are nice to us, because I think many of us were shocked. Many of us were shocked when people weren't nice to us when we went there to be the good guy. I can't remember if I told them already about the story of the little girl who had tried to commit suicide because she'd been sexually abused a lot, and then she took lots of pills, and then they took her to the hospital and pumped her stomach, all the drugs out of her, and then they put her in handcuffs, and then they brought her to us, and then she slept and slept and slept. And then the staff who was teaching me to be a staff wanted to wake her up and give her some food. And I thought that was great. I was ready. I was brand new. I wanted to help this kid. And so we eventually woke her up because it was time for her to eat for our convenience. And the kid eventually sat up and cussed us out. And I had my green little feelings hurt. Because I thought if you showed up to help somebody, they were going to immediately reciprocate with gratitude and obedience. And as you can chuckle along with me now and see how foolish and naive and young that was. But you can't tell me that many of you weren't surprised that you weren't always treated like the good guy that you meant to be. And you still got to love those people too. We've still got to love our community, unconditionally, because the reality is, if any one of us were born within the gene pool and the circumstances and the time and place and instincts and influences and norms that other people were exposed to, we would be them too. We would be the street people. We would be the junkie. We would be the people who are struggling, And many of us chose a better life, and that's great that we chose that, but it's great that we had the capacity to choose it. We had the opportunities to choose it. And so when we're all well is when we're all well. I heard that quote somewhere, and I like it. But well, I've covered most of this already, but you know, I leave those slides in there for those of you. And if anyone would like a copy of the slide, what we do, you know, in positive communication in terms of concerns or conflicts, what we do in therapeutics is we use the iMessage formula. I feel blank when blank because blank, and to, you know, to break that down, instead of saying you're an asshole because you do these things and now you're in trouble, you know, I can say I'm concerned with what I'm seeing because of the impact that it's having on you or your family or the community. You know, and again, I'm not asking any of you to be a therapist, but you do wear many hats, and so one of the things that we need to keep doing is making it about you know, about their needs, about the needs of, you know, the community, not about how strong the emotion is. If we are starting to interact in certain ways, if we increase our aggression because we're angry at them, because they've, you know, provoked strong emotions in us, then we have to step back and check it, because then it becomes about what we want, what we need in the moment. And that's not what we're on the job for. So anyway, now I'm going to show you guys another little video clip from, again, my oral favorite, Seabiscuit. And we're going to look at two different approaches to saddling the horse.
He can be a little touchy.
Yeah, I got it.
No, really.
I'm fine. Jesus Christ! The horse is nuts.
Not afraid of you. Sure. I know. I know what you're all about. Hungry? Huh? Yeah. Bet you are. Huh? Come on. Come on, boy. Yeah.
Why don't you just breeze him around one turn, give the folks a look.
Great.
Okay. So looking at that, the approaches to saddling Seabiscuit were vastly different. And so I think that it's just really, really important for us to offer some connection. I knew somebody that went somewhere in Europe for a vacation, and they went to a vendor and said, all right, I'd like to order this. And they said, whoa, 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 greet me, you know? I have a name, you know, person, how you doing, kind of thing, you know, and so in our American society, we do get in the business of seeing each other for the roles that we serve rather than for the beings that we are, you know. And of course, one of the things when we're overworked and have lots of work to do, you know, we don't have as much opportunity or time or concern about connecting. But connecting is a tool. Connecting helps us with our efficacy and, you know, with the outcome. And so, as you know, Seabiscuit shows us here, you know, the first little guy is going to saddle the horse, you know, and he says, easy, you know, this guy can be, you know, this horse can be pretty touchy, you know, or whatever. And so he says, I got this. You know, he's got the air of an expert. He knows what he's doing. He's seen it before. He's done all that, you know. He's in his first rodeo. And of course, he goes and immediately tries to saddle the horse. He tries to manage the horse. He goes immediately to attempting to get, you know, our human needs out of this being. And of course, the horse makes him pay for it. This is a very injured horse and very hypervigilant. So, of course, little Tobey Maguire character, Spider-Man, he goes in there, and he'll always be the first Spider-Man to me. I'm sorry, there's a lot of different Spider-Man movies, but anyway, so he goes in there, and the horse is bucking at him, and it's hitting the stall, and it's stay away, stay away, stay away. I'll jack you up, he's saying, you know. And that's what the horse is communicating, and he doesn't blink. He remains calm. He doesn't attempt to move on him and be aggressive with him. He said, I'm not scared of you. He talks in a calm tone. And what does he do? He says, you know, bet you're hungry. You know, want some, and he offers him some apple. And the horse reluctantly takes it. And so, you know, people have needs. You know, we can no longer just look at what people are doing and say, that's bad. No. That's not working. We've got to understand that certainly we've got to intervene and redirect and stop people from doing some of the things that they're doing. But if we don't understand some of the reasons that we're doing some of those things, if we can't offer some connection and some compassion, then we're going to get a less cooperative response, certainly from people, but also, you know, the outcome suffers, the danger level goes up for everybody involved. And this is again about being moral and about being safe. I know a lot of officers that keep snack packs, you know, non-perishable items in their car for some, you know, people that they see that are struggling to have a place to live, or a kid that they know that needs an afternoon snack. I see a lot of you guys doing that, but I'm telling you, when you recognize how a lack of basic needs or emotional needs or pain, when you can see the role that's playing in people's behavior, you know, and it's all, you know, you're going to be more effective, but it's also about rebuilding some of those challenged or strained or broken relations that exist with the community, with law enforcement in the community. And so, you know, there are aspects of the news, or some people have had a negative experience with law enforcement. And so they hear those experiences, but there's nothing like having an interaction with somebody that really cares. That gives you a new piece of data in your brain to consider. That puts a different perception and experience to draw from. So now again, people don't get to know everything about what we do in the mental health field. I mean, there's certain things that are going to be confidential. But I think we use confidentiality as necessary, certainly, and not any beyond that, because when there's a lack of information, sometimes it's just always been what we always do to keep things classified or whatever. But secrecy lends to anxiety or suspicion. And so one of the things that, you know, if I have to deliver bad news that's not of my choosing to a patient or to a family, I want to let them know that this is a policy thing. You know, I don't have a choice. You know, if I've got to make a call to child welfare, you know, I'm going to do my job, and, you know, it's the right thing to do. But also, you know, I want to, you know, protect my own license. We all have a boss, you know. And so I think one of the things that we need to remember is even if we must arrest someone, even if we must have somebody put into a facility that they don't wish to be in, the way that we do that, I think is really, really key. Recognizing, when we put someone in inpatient, we have Oklahoma State statutes, Title 43 and different ones that mandate if somebody meets certain criteria, they've got to be out of commission, out of interaction with the community for a time until we can help them assess and regain that stability. That's not because they've ticked us off, and how many times, are people, going to jail and being chastised while they're on their way, and again, I get it. Sometimes they're pretty mean and pretty nasty to you guys, but we have to recognize that they're often, interacting with you based on years and years worth of pain, not, minutes and minutes worth of interactions with you. And so that little 15-year-old girl that sat up and cussed us out, she didn't know us. She never really met us before. But all of a sudden, one of the things that I think is remarkable and surprising is, again, the staff member who was teaching me to do the job threatened to throw the little girl down. She had just tried to kill herself for being raped. And then she didn't respect the damn staff enough, and so we have to recognize that just because somebody who's engaged in some criminal or unsafe or unstable behavior, we don't see the injuries that happen. We just see the behaviors on the surface. But people act out for a reason. But anyway, transparency for trust. When we can tell them why we have to do what we do in our role, that it's not because we take any satisfaction in detaining or anything else, it's just, we have to recognize that, whenever we can open the book for folks, it's going to build trust. It's going to improve trust, and that's something that's badly needed in this day and age, I believe, and I think most of you will agree with me there. And so, us therapist types, we teach lots of communication skills and coping skills, and these are things, I don't know why that's only for us to talk about, because it's not like we're the only people that have to interact with emotional problems. And so, one of the things, your communication skills and your coping skills are something that you need to practice. And I don't mean practice when you need them. You need to rehearse them and familiarize with them and plant those seeds. You need to do that when things are cool. When they teach kids fire drills and tornado drills in school, the reason that they do that is so people have some base familiarity with what to do if the time, God forbid, ever comes that we must evacuate the building or take cover from a tornado. And so we need to know, because when we're stressed out, when we're in crisis, the brain's capacities for problem solving are greatly diminished. We're not good at thinking good. When our stress level increases. We know that. We don't tell the kids, we have never had a fire at this school. Let's just forgo the fire alarms and the fire, whatever, drills. And we'll just figure it out when it happens, if it ever does, God forbid. They don't do that. And so one of the things I do recognize, you guys don't choose how well you're trained. And so I don't knock you for this, but I do recognize that the numbers that I'm coming up with in my research is that police officers get about 8 hours of training with their people skills, their brain and their heart and their verbal de-escalation skills, and about 129 to 130 hours with the gun and with the weapons. And again, I don't think that we should diminish any of the time. I mean, you've got to know how to use those things and use them well and use them as needed and effectively and in a quick response time and everything else. But 8 hours with our words, that's a joke. That's not okay, because we're going to reach for whatever we practice with most. So if we don't practice with our words and our ways that we can use these tools, these most essential of human tools, then we're not going to be reaching for them as readily and as skillfully. Because we need to be using just as much of those people skills. We don't usually have to ever do a tornado, take cover thing, most of us, and most of us don't ever have to evacuate a building. But we've got to drill our people skills because we will need those skills daily. That won't be a drill. And so I just want to challenge police departments, trainers, police academies to recognize that, we probably need to keep spending that much time on the guns, and we probably just need to spend a lot more time on the words and the way that we look and the way we sound in using those. So one of the things, I teach with kids and families and anyone really that needs to know it is we can change our brain. We can identify where our learning comes from and where our injuries come from. And we can identify areas where we've developed negative ways of coping with or dealing with those. And so, and over time, if we replace negative ways of expressing and coping with our emotions, we can actually literally give ourselves new development. Now, it takes lots of practice. I mentioned that, I think all of us have human tail wags, things that we do that make our own situations worse sometimes, our negative responses to those triggers that we each have individually. But we can recognize our human tail wags and we can do something about them. We don't have to just say, yeah, that's what I do. I know, I recognize that I have a problem when I do this, but we can do something about that. We're not doomed to that development. And so I call it identify, challenge, and change. Now, over time, if we repeat a new skill, a new habit, now it feels unnatural at first. That's why it takes so much rehearsal to change our brain, but we can change our brain. And it takes more than 8 hours of rehearsal with our words and with our coping and our self-care. We have to practice that so much more. But if we catch ourselves doing the thing that we used to do that we don't like so much, that didn't have a good outcome for our health or our family or our job or whatever, if we catch ourselves doing that thing and then we repeatedly replace it, over time it starts to feel more natural. And then we've given ourselves a new neural pathway, a new synaptic connection, and a new instinct. And old instincts can creep up sometimes, just like a smoker who hasn't smoked in 20 years smells a cigarette every now and then and says, at first though, that craving was really, really strong. But over time, the less we use a neural pathway, the less we engage a habit, that neural pathway gets old. And it must give way to new development in the brain. And so that's why it takes a lot of discipline and practice. People who have to change habits or want to change habits have to recognize it hurts a little bit. It stings. It's going to be unpleasant. You just kind of have to grit your teeth and do some other things and help yourself in the ways that you can. But we have a problem in our state. We're so high in ACEs. We, each and every one of us, have a duty to try to help kids identify and challenge and change what they do. And so we have, I think, a duty to make our country and our world really about the liberty and justice that we all, deserve. Because that's a value that we claim as an American people. And truly, many people's experience of that American dream is quite different. And some don't appear to have liberty and justice for all. So we have to identify the long-term impacts from early things that we had nothing to do with. But when you're in it, sometimes you can't always see the long view, and we have to kind of dig for the things that don't make sense or that aren't helping us move forward as a people. So, I think that we would have to acknowledge that we're not doing all that we can for kids. And, our world is showing for it. Like the old song says, I believe the children are our future. Well, a lot of our kids are not being cared for or supported or provided well enough for and are protected and allowed to be safe. So those kids are our future too, and our future's coming true right before our eyes. And so some of the true problem makers of the world, I think, just needed a few more hugs. There's bad leaders and bad business people and bad people in the world who perhaps didn't have to be that. And again, I say bad, we're not supposed to use that because that's not very scientific. But there's a lot of problem makers out there that needed to be cared for better and have their emotional needs met better. Because we're suffering as a result of it. Now, I will say kids in all socioeconomic classes are struggling. And a lot of times it's the rich kids or the kids from more affluent families or of some means. They got everything they need because they have a nice car and all the gadgets and nice clothes or whatever. A lot of those kids, some of those kids don't get much attention from their parents. So I think resources sometimes can hide or mask some unmet needs, but there is certainly some disproportionate harm happening because of inequality. And so many of us, we care about kids, and we especially care about our kids. I have a little girl, and I'm all about that kid, But if I don't care about her neighbor, the other kids in her class, then my kid, as much as she's my heart, my heart can be taken away from me in a heartbeat. And so we can't just make it about our kids. A lot of us are willing to donate to the school that our kid goes to or to support the activities in our neighborhood. But again, all kids deserve to have a safe place to go to school and to have so many of the things. So a sane society, a civil society, a moral society, it does protect all children, and we're not doing that. Again, so just like, a lot of our mission statements, a lot of our preambles, a lot of our, lofty policies and laws and constitutions, I think those, we have to remember that those are aspirational. Because I do think that we mean it, but we're not realizing that liberty and justice for all and for all kids. And so, therapeutic relationship. I'll just say, you guys are not therapists, but you're lots of different things at different times. And anyone can be therapeutic. To be therapeutic means to be beneficial in some way. But a therapeutic relationship, officers and any safe adult can help a kid feel okay about themselves. Like Robert said, just 8 seconds of positive interaction with an adult that takes an interest with a kid, that gets down on their level and really shows a genuine interest, that does some really positive things for a kid neurologically. And so, in my therapy world, studies by people like Scott Miller have shown us that whether a therapist has been in the game for 2 years or for 20 years, people benefited more from how well they connected to their therapist, not how many years or what a great expert they were. So a therapeutic relationship, emotions are these chemical and electrical, processes that happen. My first patient years ago, she would talk as long as you let her, and then she'd tell me thank you. And she felt better, and I didn't understand at the time. But our memories are not in words. But when we have to put our memories and experiences into words, they move to that part of our brain that has vocabulary, and we learn something from that transfer of data, and it does reduce some of that neurochemical and electrical impulse. A lot of times we gain perspective and we learn things about the data that's in our brain just by talking about it. That's kind of interesting. But we're going to wrap up soon, but we've got a couple more slides to show you guys. So, again, it's important for you to take measured and calculated steps to manage your stress. A lot of people want to feel better, but they're not doing stuff to a lot of times, feelings will pass like a storm, but sometimes we can help ourselves, and we need to. But we have to recognize that we work with a high stress job and population, and the reality is, we teach mental health professionals who deal with a lot of this emotional contagion. As mental health professionals, if we're not managing stress and diet, sleep, and exercise and using our coping skills, then we're not really even practicing our work ethically, because we recognize that if we don't manage our strong emotions, and if we don't manage our own health and stress, then we're not as capable of doing our jobs well. And people need us to do our jobs well. So it is important to have a plan. At the Children's Hospital, we required every single staff member to have a safety plan for their own coping, and we gave room to use it. And we carried it on a little necklace thing around with our name tag, to show this is what we do. It modeled the skill for kids. And it reminded us of our own need. So, psychological education, and again, I'm not going to expect a lot of officers to be educating people about the symptoms of their trauma, but we can all work from our angle. When we do have to intervene, one of the things that we can do is help a kid accept themselves, not their behavior perhaps if it's not okay, but we need to help kids forgive themselves for being injured and doing what injured people do. When I educate people of all ages, when I educate officers, when I go over those symptoms, re-experiencing intrusive symptoms, hyperarousal, avoidance, numbing, fear, distrust, shame, and guilt, those are perfectly healthy human responses to unhealthy, abnormally stressful human events. And so, again, we know how people are going to struggle if they have certain experiences, certain stress levels, or prolonged levels of time. So we know, and so we need to help people forgive themselves for being injured and doing what injured people do. And you guys have to think about how you do that when you're interacting with an injured person. Maybe it's that person that you've taken to jail a half a dozen times. How do you help them identify challenge and change? They're feeling like hell. They know they have a problem. How do we help them forgive themselves? Because see, the part of the problem is when people feel like shit, that's how they do. When you're beat down and when you feel like crap and you've been judged and shamed and punished and been in trouble a lot and you struggle emotionally and perhaps it came from an early age you've been told you were bad, then the world, you're doing just exactly like in the video. Doing what the world taught you to do. When it was your time to race, you did what they taught and you lost. And a lot of these people are going around the track again and again losing. And so maybe when you're taking them in this time, you say, some words of encouragement. I know you've been through a lot. It's just saying things like you're injured and you're doing some injured things. Forgive yourself for that and maybe you can change it. Because when we can get people to have those light bulbs going off and some other people, care about them. Because again, in crisis, we need two things. We need coping and connection. We need relief and another person to give a damn. And so you might be the one that piles on a bit more shame, or you might be the one that helps them see a little bit of light in the dark. And so psychological education is about helping people understand why they do what they do when they do. And so, but from your angle, helping people recognize everybody that's in the back of your car is injured. There's not people that have had a great life that are out there drinking and drugging typically and engaging in some of those things occasionally, but not usually. So some generalized compassion, even though you may not know of their specific injuries, you're not going to see that. You only get that ugly tip of the iceberg, that brought you to their interaction and their intervention. So if you can help people, it doesn't mean excusing their behavior or letting them off the hook. Sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes it's not even appropriate to do that. But doing your job, it will allow you to offer some educational components. And again, many of us will be able to help someone forgive themselves for being injured, because a lot of them, it started their aces. A lot of them, they weren't big enough to to run away from the danger or to defend themselves from the danger or to get better circumstances for themselves. They're just grown up now. And so a lot of those are still little kids, just in bigger bodies, bigger injured bodies. And so whatever you can do from your angle to help people forgive themselves for being injured is key. I have a training that I'm going to be doing here in a couple months called Teaching is Healing, Psychoeducational Foundations for Recovery, because it really is a foundation. We've got to rebuild self-esteem and feel even worthy of this thing called recovery if we're really going to engage in efforts that are going to get us there. So one of the slides, in one of the 3 ACEs slides I showed you earlier in the presentation, it lists the 10 ACEs. And so you can look at those and check them out if you like. I have to be careful when I present the ACEs because I'm not, it can be kind of a devastating or gloomy outcome. So it means I'm going to be dead sooner. A lot of people will see that as a foregone conclusion if they have a lot of ACEs. But what I see is it gives us a point of intervention. We can highlight their resilience. But also I think it's important for us to recognize our own ACEs. If it's caused us to, have any negative ways of coping or thinking about some of our own programming instincts and influences. It's about, our own resilience, but if it caused us to ignore these injuries in ourselves or our families or in the communities that we serve, we have to recognize that lots of things are traumatic for kids, but those 10 ACEs, if you have some, then you've been affected, and so, but thinking about who you looked up to, and what made a difference in your life, what helped you get through, and what didn't. What was helpful and what in particular was not. And we can't project those onto every single person, but it does offer some insight because every human being is unique and different, but we do have a lot of dynamics that, kind of develop in pattern. So I'm on my last slide now, and I know we've been, it's kind of been a long day. I hope that you've maybe been able to break this up. Take a little, break in the middle. I think we give them a break on there. Every single one of us has a role in culture. There are people who, human beings learn by imitation, and learning is foundational. And so just like you've ever heard a catchphrase in a movie or a commercial or something like that, and then people were saying it and doing it, that contributed to culture. Well, people look to the leaders of their communities. And so we want to be mindful, and being mindful is challenging in a world that has us running a race. It's easy to be on autopilot and reactive mode, but it's going to be important for us to recognize that, the things that we do each day, these things matter. And so we need to mindfully care about what we contribute to culture, about what we are, the example we're teaching and what we're teaching to the next generation of mental health professionals, of law enforcement officers, of human beings. I think problems are so big, systems are so big. Sometimes if you're in a big department or in a big city or, but the problems of the world are immense and overwhelming and vast and numerous and all these things. And so it's really, really easy for us to feel lost in the system and like who are we? We're just one person, and then that contagion takes over. And then a lot of people are saying, yeah, that's just the way it is. What are you going to do? And so we do belong to our systems, but we each individually have our contribution. And so I may get lost in we sometimes, but I think we have a responsibility. You guys are the heroes. You guys are the ones that run into danger and face the wicked stuff that nobody else wants to deal with. And so, but it's not getting better, it doesn't seem like. And so I think each one of us can do something about this, and from our angle, we can help change Oklahoma ACEs. But again, I think we each have to ask ourselves what we will do to contribute to a better, a safer, a healthier culture for our kids, for our families, and how we will do our job safer, because I don't have all the answers, but we can police more emotionally intelligent for safer service outcomes. So thank you guys from the bottom of my heart for what you do for us. For our world and for our community. I want to thank Robert, my bro, and the Evolution Foundation, Jeff, and all of you guys for sponsoring us to do this. Travis, my guy at 27 Productions, and also aka Travis Kelly Productions. He's a good guy and he's helping us produce some good work, even though I don't always give him a lot of good material to work with. But if you have any questions for us about how to get your certificate or how to sign in or how to get a copy of today's presentation, email us at info@newviewhealingsolutions.org. And thanks again.